After the incident, my therapist urged me to keep a diary. The incident occurred last year, and, long story short, involved me attempting to burn down the local Catholic church in the middle of the night. The fallout from that adventure was handled discreetly, as such things usually are when you have wealthy parents, but I did not get off scot-free, and had to endure various forms of punishment, chief among them having to keep a diary. Kate, my therapist, who happens to be my father's chum, had said, "Your reluctance to talk about your feelings, I believe, is a large part of why you act out. And since you clearly have trust issues, perhaps we can kill two birds with one stone, as they say, and you can keep a journal where you talk to yourself about what happened every day and how you feel about it. Perhaps once you learn to trust yourself, you can start to trust others, and then you can talk to them about your feelings." All I ever wrote in that diary was a bunch of nonsense that I thought would make my parents, who snuck into my room every day to read the thing, satisfied enough to leave me alone. That's all I ever wrote in it, anyway, until the day I met Red, when I recorded the experience with breathless awe, with complete earnest, and then hid the journal away where nobody could find it. Before I share that first entry, I want to be absolutely clear that I wrote this account after I experienced the events it discusses. I clearly remember sitting in my bed, opening the drawer of my nightstand, withdrawing a pen and the diary, and writing the following. Sunday, October 18th, 2020. Dear Diary, Red, where did he come from? Where has he been hiding my entire life? It doesn't matter. I found him, standing there in Heritage Park, in the most ridiculous outfit. Now that I think about it, he didn't have a scrap of red on him anywhere. Every other color, though, a patchwork of all the other colors of the rainbow, and many more, stitched together as if by the world's most deranged grandmother. And his hair long and thick and black, but no red. "My name's Red," he said, as I was walking past him on my way to the coffee shop. I hadn't paid him any mind yet, and at the time, he seemed just another desperate performer, same as anyone. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Fuck off," I said. "Fuck off," said Red. "That sounds Russian. Are you Russian, young lady?" I stopped walking and turned to face him. He had deep blue eyes. "No," I said. "I'm American, through and through." "But you were Russian, weren't you? Off to the coffee shop, perhaps. I suppose that's rather an American thing to do, always rushing around. It's always perfectly consistent. It all makes perfect sense." I looked to the ground where Red had placed a top hat, upside down, which had $3 or $4 bills inside of it, along with some loose change. "All right, what's your deal then? You just stand here and do dad jokes?" "No, that's just how I draw them in. Little buffoonish humor." "So, what do you do?" I asked, deciding that if he didn't give a good enough answer, I'd keep walking. "Many things, young lady. Many things. But for you, I'll show you things as they truly are, and not as people pretend them to be. It's not a talent I use often, but something about you tells me that you're ready to see through the facade. Am I right? I suppose that I was in for a cheap magic trick or something like that, but had to, sadly, admit to myself that it was already the most interesting thing that had happened to me in several weeks. "Sure," I said. "Good. Now look over yonder." Red swung his multicolored arm out and pointed at a man jogging through the park. There was nothing unusual about the man. He was very fit and attractive, dressed in a tank top that barely contained his bulging muscles, and he was dripping with sweat, listening to music of some kind, or maybe just an inspirational recording of his own voice saying, "You are an incredible specimen. Nothing can stop you." In short, he made my stomach turn, but then, most people did that. "So?" I asked, turning back to Red. "Did you really look? Try again." I sighed with disappointment. I don't know what I thought would happen, but looked again at the jogging man. This time he was quite different. Now he was simian, looking for all the world like a giant monkey, with a monkey face and monkey limbs. He was dressed in the same sort of absurd garb that Red was wearing, with tattered bits of blue and yellow and pink flapping around as he moved along in a waddle, lifting each leg high and bringing it down somewhere off to the side like a big, awkward crab monkey clown. I laughed, partially out of shock and partially out of delight. "How did you do that?" I asked. "That man's your sidekick, right? And you had a monkey hiding in the bushes that he switched out when I wasn't looking?" "Not at all, dear. The monkey is the man. I have, as promised, merely shown you things as they really are. Or, rather, things as they are beneath the first layer. It's what you've always suspected, isn't it? That the world is full of people pretending to be something they're not. That once you strip the pretense away, people are simply dumb monkeys waddling through life in a comically exaggerated fashion without any real purpose. You can sense that it's true, but the deceit is great enough to trick your very eyes. You see men and women dressed to the nines, appreciating life with a deadly seriousness, and you begin to doubt yourself. Well, doubt yourself no more. You have seen the truth." An eerie feeling passed over me, and for a moment I believed what he said. But when I looked at the jogging man for the third time, he was only that. A man, going on a late morning jog. "No, really, how did you do that?" "Would you like to see even deeper?" "Yes," I said, without hesitation. "Then come back tomorrow. Same place, same time." I will," I said. Then I remembered that I had school. I was down to my final warning, and couldn't afford to miss another class. "Oh, I can't. Will you be here later, in the afternoon?" "I will certainly try to be. For now, I must move on." Red bent down, scooped the money out of his hat, and stuffed it into an enormous pocket. I felt a sudden pang of guilt, as I didn't have any cash with which to reward this man for so thoroughly entertaining me. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I don't have any money on me, just a credit card. I'll bring some tomorrow, I promise." "Think nothing of it, young lady," said Red, flipping the hat through the air and catching it expertly on top of his head. "I do hope to see you tomorrow." Then he turned and waddled off through the park. I stood there for a long time, full of wonder, trying to figure out how he had done it. In the end, I decided it didn't matter, and went ahead to the coffee shop. As I waited in line, I began to picture the people around me as clownish monkeys, the same as the jogging man in the park. I had to hold my hand over my mouth to keep from erupting in laughter. Now here I am in bed, and I have not stopped thinking about Red all day. His magic trick was, quite possibly, the light of my life. Certainly the best thing that's happened to me in years and years. A splash of colorful paint across a dull and dreary canvas of lifeless grays. I absolutely cannot wait to see him again, and discover what else he has in store for me. I truly doubt anything can top what he's done already, but we'll see. Meanwhile, I have no choice but to contain my excitement and wait until after school tomorrow. Unless I don't. I'll get in trouble, but what does it matter? It's a world full of monkey clowns. What's the worst they can do to me? Throw a pie in my face? And so I concluded my first real diary entry, hiding it inside an old stuffed bear I found in the back of my closet. Then I settled into bed and tried to go to sleep. My excitement made that difficult, but I also felt a deep and easy peace that I hadn't known for a long time. I had a friend, somebody who understood the world as I understood it, and was delightfully entertaining as well. And so I finally sunk into sleep, and dreamt of a carnival deep in the wild, primordial swamp, where reptiles crawled out of the murky depths and devoured mountains of cotton candy. The next morning I woke up full of energy, having resolved to ditch class and meet Red at the park. I did not want to miss him and whatever wonderful trick he had in mind to show me. Predictably, my phone started to buzz a few minutes after I was off school grounds, so I switched it off and shoved it into my purse. Then I walked to the park, feeling light and free despite the certain punishment I would face at the end of the day. Red was standing in the same place as before, but when I approached him, I saw that he was sad. Now, at last, he had some red to him. though it was where his eyes should have been white. He had obviously been crying. "What's wrong?" I asked when I was close enough. "Oh, sweetheart, I did not expect to see you at this hour," he said, sniffling and wiping his nose with his colorful sleeve. "Catherine," I said. "My name's Catherine." "Why are you crying?" "Catherine, a wonderful name. Forgive me, my dear. I was only lamenting the fact that I've been robbed. Every hard-earned penny gone. It wasn't much, but I came by it honestly, or maybe I didn't. I forget. It doesn't matter one bit, though, now that you're here." I'd come prepared with 2 $100 bills, pilfered from my father's wallet. He wouldn't miss them. I dropped one into Red's hat. "This is for yesterday, and I've got another for today, assuming you have a new trick for me." "You're too kind, Catherine. Too kind. I'll have to conjure up a good one. But I'll remind you, they're not tricks at all. I would never trick you, Catherine. The others, yes, of course. I will dazzle them by pulling a rabbit out of nowhere or make a ball jump unseen from cup to cup. Cheap illusions, but for you, only the truth. Only things as they really are. 1 minute now, hold on. Okay, here comes our jogger. Same one from yesterday. Are you ready?" "Yes." "Then look." I turned my head, expecting to be delighted again. What I saw shocked me with its grotesquerie. The jogging man now appeared not as a comical monkey, but as something long dead, with rotten flesh slogging away from the bone and feasted upon by swarms of squirming worms. This alone was enough to make me retch, but what set my mind spinning to the edge of madness was the way the thing moved. It wasn't as if in the movies, where the dead came back to life and lumber around awkwardly with crude control over their bodies, but at least some control, and that certainly would have been terrifying enough. But the uncanny corpse that I saw now appeared to be moved by several pairs of invisible hands, one set lifting a limp leg in the air here, another giving a shove from behind there, a third holding the body up from under its arms in order to prevent the entire show from collapsing. The effect was of something truly and finally dead, and not somehow reanimated, moving around in the world of the living. "Catherine," asked Red, "what's wrong? Are you not delighted?" I snapped around with a rush of anger crashing around a sense of implacable dread. "It's awful," I said. Red frowned. "My darling, you're going to make me cry again. I thought we shared an affinity for the truth." "That's not the truth," I spat, pointing behind me, but unwilling to look at that direction again. "But it is. At a more fundamental level, these people you see all around you are nothing but worm food, temporarily controlled by unseen forces, being moved witlessly from point A to B until they grow too heavy and bloated to be moved around any longer, and the showrunners find fresher meat. I thought you would like to see this." "Fuck off," I said, and I crumpled up the other $100 bill and threw it in his face. Then I walked away, keeping my eyes on the ground and trying not to break down. In my mind, I could still picture the dead jogger being forced to jog away as he decomposed into pure rot. At one point, I looked up to see Red bend down and pick up the wad of money. "Fucking fraud," I muttered, and went to bring my vision back down to my shoes, but along the way, I caught sight of another dead person. This one looked to be a woman, her clothes stained black and brown with her own fluids, jerking forward down a path in unnaturally floppy fits and starts. Then the stench hit me, and I surveyed the park ahead on and saw that it was filled with the dead, going about their mindless business, dozens of them, heads bouncing on limp necks from side to side or front to back as they were shoved along by invisible hands. I ran home, as though myself being poked by some unseen prod, and when I swung the door open, I was greeted by my mother, though mercifully she did not appear dead. "Katie," she began, in a voice hung between anger and relief. I wrapped my arms around her and started to sob. "I'm so sorry," I wailed, "about the way I've acted, the way I've been, about everything. "Shh," said my mother.
"Everything's going to be okay. Mommy's here for you."
After a long session with my mom, in which I kept details sparse, I headed up to my room. I was going to spill my guts out to my diary, not just about the awful things that Red had shown me, but about all sorts of things that I now realized were true about myself. In the course of a few hours, I had suddenly shed years' worth of carefully constructed defense mechanisms. I went to the closet, felt around until I found my old teddy bear, and pulled the diary out. I took it over to my bed, where I propped up some pillows and settled in to write my epic confessional. I flipped through the pages of lies I had felt so clever in creating, until I got to the previous day's entry. Sunday, the day I met Red. I cringed as I glanced over those words, then hurriedly turned the page. It was already filled in. What the fuck? I lifted the journal up to my face and squinted. It was my own handwriting, my own style, too. Dear Diary, today was fucked up. That was exactly how I intended to begin the entry. Absurdly, I turned my eyes to my right hand, as if I would find some kind of answer etched into my palm. I didn't, of course. There was just the usual pattern of creases and whorls. I stared at it for a long time until it began to look strange, like an alien creature onto itself. Then I snapped out of it, took a deep breath, and read the rest of the entry. It described my day exactly, starting with the excitement I had felt in seeing Red again, and ending with me coming up to my room to write it all down. When I had finished reading, I closed the diary, got up, and replaced it in the teddy bear. I tried not to think about it. For the next 3 days, I was a model citizen. I groveled at the principal's feet in complete earnest for another chance. I did all my homework and ate all my veggies. I refrained from making sarcastic remarks and even from smoking weed. Seeing those corpses, jostled around by invisible masters, had shaken me to my core. Suddenly, life seemed worthwhile to me, even if it meant doing all the things that had appeared ridiculous and pointless before. Maybe especially if it meant doing all that. The mundane was a talisman to be wielded against death, if only because going through the motions meant avoiding thinking about it all. At the end of the 3rd day of my reformed life, Thursday, I decided to revisit my diary. I had brushed aside the previous incident as a trick of my overstressed mind. I must have written that entry in a daze, and then, when I came back to myself, I'd forgotten about it. But there was no rationalizing away what came next. I opened the journal and flipped to the last entry. It was for Friday, October 23rd, which is to say, the future. It was, again, written in my own handwriting, in my voice. It was a long, rambling chapter about how my father had had a heart attack. It had been a non-fatal one, I wrote, but it still fucked me up. I'd visited him in the hospital during mealtime, and he had been eating a fruit cup, but he looked like all those people in the park. Dead, crawling with worms, with some force lifting his dead hand and awkwardly shoving a spoonful of fruit into his mouth. The food fell out directly and slid down his chin in a river of various fluids that had poured out of him. I blinked, and he was alive again. I had written at length about how I didn't want my dad to die, and how I didn't want anybody to die, and how scared I was. I read all of this in a state of shock, but even by the end of it, it was possible to explain away if I tried hard enough. Red's cheap magic trick had simply gotten too deep in my brain. I was imagining things that hadn't happened, writing things about these imaginings, and then forgetting having written them. But when, on Friday, my father had a non-fatal heart attack, and I visited him in the hospital, where he appeared dead to me for a moment, like I said, there was no rationalizing that away. My father returned home on Saturday, and despite him just having come within an inch of death, I do think that he was in better shape than me. To put it mildly, I had a lot on my mind. There were the visions of corpses that Red had shown me, which haunted me at random moments throughout the day, and in my dreams. Then there was my father's cardiac event. which just drove it home even deeper how fragile and precious everything was, despite the layers of gristle I had piled up around my physique to protect me from this realization. Next, of course, there was the fact that my diary was somehow filling itself in a day ahead of time. These added together were bad enough, but there was something else, too, on top of it all. It was a feeling in my stomach and my throat, a thought clawing at the back of my mind, that what Red had shown me was more real than the reality I saw, and that there were things more real than even that, and that it was all terrible. I would look at a shadow, and it would seem to hold more substance than whatever was casting it, and I sensed that it contained depths that nobody understood or was capable of understanding. I spent the better part of Saturday in my room alone, trying to hold it together, feeling always on the verge of cracking apart into jagged pieces of incoherence. I took out some pills that I had been prescribed but declined to take, and now swallowed 2 of them. When those failed to have any effect, I snuck down the hall to my parents' bedroom and rifled through their medicine cabinet until I found something stronger. And if it had all ended there, I think I might have been able, in time, to cope. The pills did their trick and knocked me out. I awoke later in the morning on Sunday, still feeling the pleasant haze of the drug. I felt protected, as if nothing could hurt me. It was then that I decided it would be a good idea to look through my diary again. It can't hurt you, I told myself. And now I have been sitting on my bed for hours, trembling, dead sober. Or am I? Is this really happening? It feels as real as anything that's ever happened to me, but has that all been real? I don't know. All I know is that when I opened my diary, this is what was waiting for me on the last page. All I know is that when I opened my diary, this is what was waiting for me on the last page. Monday, October 26th, 2020. Dear Kate, I don't think it matters what you do. Red will find you, and when he finds you, I would suggest not trying to escape. Maybe you will be luckier than I was, but if you're not, you're better off not fighting. He tells me that our suffering is in proportion to how much we struggle against it. He is going to take me now to the church, the same one that I tried to burn down last year. He thinks that's very funny. He says that flames dance everywhere all the time, and that they define the limits of the world, and that once I see them, that once I really see them, he is going to take me past the flames, he says, and show me something more beautiful than I can comprehend. He says that there is nothing to be afraid of, but I'm afraid. I'm really fucking afraid. I am too, Katie. Jesus Christ. I am too. Maxwell awoke to that same flicker that had been taunting him for several years now. It glowed just outside his bedroom, slightly bigger than the flaming wick of a candle, but nearly identical in shape and somewhat foggier, even on the clearest summer nights like this one. He had first asked his mom about it when he was 6 years old, and she quickly brushed it off as just some light coming from the neighbor's house. But Maxwell kept insisting that it was much closer, just a foot or so from the vinyl siding, seemingly floating above the narrow strip of grass that separated their property from the Petchman's house. Maxwell's father then laughed at this detail and deduced, "Sounds like you're seeing Mr. Peckman having a cigarette after he comes home late at night." He then lowered his brow and made contact with his wife. "Mr. Peckman might be swaying a little bit when he gets home and has a cigarette. I bet that's your flicker, Max." Maxwell's mom laughed as well, not out of humor but pure disdain, and added, "Probably smokes half a pack before he feels ready to go inside the house the way he shows up home. Did you see the skid marks he left on their driveway the other week? Not to mention the way he tore up our side grass with his truck right back around Christmas." But it was not Mr. Peckman, for Maxwell saw no man, and not even a silhouette outside his bedroom window. Just the flicker, glowing and radiating and floating up and down like an almond-shaped orb, yellow-orange and soft on the edges. Maxwell did often hear the sounds and commotion that his parents had spoken of in regards to Mr. Peckman and his late-night arrivals at home, The roar of his truck's V8 and the occasional thud of its front grille concussed the plastic trash can where he overshot his landing. Maxwell would hear Mr. Petchman's coughs and spits and belches and even his streams of urine into the bushes. And yes, he would look out to see him smoking a cigarette at times, but never, no chance could that be confused for the flicker. Mr. Petchman was twice as loud as the flicker was soft, and rarely did he stay outside on that narrow driveway for longer than a couple of minutes. For Maxwell would then see the lights come on next door and often hear crashing from inside the house, followed by yelling and crying and everything that made him realize with each year older why his neighbor Spencer Petchman always seemed so much angrier and volatile than the other boys at school. Maxwell and Spencer had been fairly close as young boys, playing in each other's nearly shared backyard spaces and riding bikes down the sidewalk as they aged. Maxwell had even asked him about the flicker once, and he knew Spencer's bedroom looked down from the second story of his own house right into the space outside Maxwell's window. Spencer had looked at Maxwell confused. What? No. Then completely changed the subject. But around 9 or 10, the boys diverged paths. Spencer fell in with some junior high kids, got into fistfights, was even brought home in a police cruiser once after an incident with spray paint and the fences at the nearby Little League field. Maxwell and Spencer were on fine terms and would still talk here and there, but they certainly weren't close when the incident occurred. The flicker had been waking Maxwell now for nearly all his conscious years, yet it never crossed his mind to confront the image. At first, he had been too scared, not just at the prospect of going out into the darkness alone, but the fear of consequences he might face from his parents for unlocking the front door at night. They don't live in a dangerous neighborhood per se, but car break-ins were not uncommon, and his father always seems to highlight in casual conversation about how that rough North End is only a few blocks away, really. But on this night, with the thick humid air and 3 a.m. temperature still stubbornly stalled in the mid-70s, and Maxwell now a young man of nearly 11 years old, he quietly turned open his door, crept through the living room, slipped on his rubber sandals that were left by the door, quietly unlatched the deadbolts, and entered alone into the nocturnal version of all that was so familiar. Maxwell rounded the corner of his house that faced the Petchman's driveway, and he immediately saw it floating there still outside his window. The flicker. It appeared so much brighter from out here, nearly the size of a toy football, and as he gazed on it with wonder, it was as though the flicker somehow noticed him noticing it. He swore that he saw it turn towards him and look straight into him. With no eyes, but simply that familiarly haunting glow, he stepped closer to it and felt compelled to call out, "What are you?" Maxwell extended his arms and held out his hand to touch the space it occupied, but just then the flicker abruptly jerked to the right, planted itself firmly in the middle of the Petchman's driveway, and Maxwell followed. He reached out yet again and found himself enveloped in full-on beaming light coming from his back. He turned and it shone in his face, but it was too late for Maxwell to move out of the way of Mr. Petchman's truck. Maxwell was knocked unconscious immediately, and he nearly died in that driveway before an ambulance could even arrive. He swore, though, that he retained a memory of lying there on the warm asphalt, staring vacantly upward towards the flicker as it floated just above the hood of Mr. Petchman's truck. It was never really asked of Maxwell what exactly he was doing in his neighbor's driveway that night at 3 a.m. Rather, it was explained to him by doctors and psychologists and lawyers and various specialists that he had experienced a state of somnambulism, likely triggered by ongoing night terrors. Maxwell did not ever mention the flicker to anyone. It all seemed very far off and distant from the following months of hospital stays and physical therapy and courtrooms. Not many questions whatsoever were asked of Maxwell. Those were instead directed towards Mr. Petchman, who supplied in a series of interviews, depositions, and sentencing hearings that he was a severe alcoholic with 2 previous DWI convictions, a history of domestic violence, and that he had been drinking vodka Red Bulls down at CJ's Tavern that night until the bar closed, before barreling into the 10-year-old neighborhood kid Maxwell and slurring a call to 911. Maxwell felt somewhat wrong going forward so full bore with the charges and lawsuits. He knew that for all the man's faults, he was still Spencer's dad, and deep down, even at his reckless, drunken speed, how could Mr. Petchman have expected anyone to be in his driveway at that hour? Maxwell's dad even questioned their course of action at times. "He nearly killed my son, but we are definitely ruining his life." But the medical bills alone warranted the lawsuits, and the prosecutors sought to make an example of serial drunk drivers. Maxwell never even had to take the stand. Mr. Petchman was sentenced to 5 years in prison in front of Maxwell, his father, and his mother, while on the other side of the courtroom, a terminally worn-down Miss Petchman wept dejected tears. Spencer stood in front of her in a clip-on tie and a gold cross pendant pierced through his left ear. He looked the same as always, disinterested and angry. The years of adolescence would pass, and so would the wounds upon Maxwell's body. As he healed, memories of the flicker seemed to fade away with each milestone of recovery. By age 15, Maxwell no longer even needed the routine checkups on where surgeons had repaired his spinal column. He rarely thought about the incidents and never about the flicker on its own. It seemed to be firmly lodged into that one night, completely cut off from the years of memory that preceded it. Maxwell moved on with his life unquestioning. The Petchmans moved on as well, quickly selling their house to pay for lawyers' fees. Maxwell had not spoken to Spencer since the incident, but not by intent. Upon moving, Spencer transferred into the schools on the North End, where he gravitated towards an even tougher crowd. The last Maxwell ever heard of Spencer was that he had dropped out sometime in 11th grade. Nothing much was heard of the Petchmans beyond that they divorced about a year into Mr. Petchman's sentence, and that Miss Petchman would often berate his name amongst the same old crowd as CJ's. On multiple occasions, too, it is said that she would curse Maxwell and his family for ruining their lives. But even her most strident allies found it to be a line of reasoning hard to fully go along with. The settlement paid out well to Maxwell and his family. While a future of community college and continued lower-middle-class substance had awaited before the incident, Maxwell found himself with the opportunity to attend university and his parents with the ability to purchase boats and vacation rentals, a ticket to the world of excess they had always dreamed about. When Max was nearing the end of his studies, he got word from a high school acquaintance that Mr. Petchman had died. In the ensuing years after his release from prison, he hit the bottle harder and harder, struggling to ever find his way into the world beyond that one night. He passed away in the cab of an older model Ford Ranger that apparently he lived out of, his only real possession. Maxwell felt awful upon hearing this. The acquaintance who had told him expected him to be somewhat relieved, as though Maxwell feared Mr. Petchman's split-second assault on him to last into perpetuity. The truth was, Maxwell had hardly thought about him at all in nearly a decade. He hadn't even considered whether he had been released or not. Maxwell's thoughts briefly went to Spencer, or, truly, the faint ghost of a memory of the boy he had once lived next to. He felt sorrow on a human level, but wondered more out of sick curiosity how bad Spencer had turned out. And at that very thought, of voyeuristically gawking at the hypothetical shitty life of a childhood playmate, another image popped into Maxwell's head. The flicker. It danced about his consciousness, glowing just as it had before the headlights swallowed it whole, just as he had once imagined it floating above his mangled body as blood poured from every crack on his face, and the bitter taste of what he now knew was spinal fluid filled the back of his throat. Maxwell closed his eyes tighter and tighter, feeling just as afraid as a boy first seeing it at 6 years old, and upon realizing the tension in his face, the flicker was once again gone from his memory for many years. Maxwell was quite successful in the world of sales. He traveled around the country and lived the life of a wealthy young bachelor. He leased a luxury apartment on the top floor of an old building downtown, converted from old ethnic tenements in the name of urban renewal and access to an unsurpassed view of the city that had all but demanded higher rents. Maxwell had lived there just over a year, having moved in with the first wave of new tenants around the renovations. He loved the place, but routinely spent many nights away on business. Late one summer evening, as he rode the elevator up from the gym in the building's basement, Maxwell casually checked his phone. thumbing through the different apps for notifications that he may have missed while working out. Nothing of note, really, but one thing caught his eye under the banner at the bottom of Facebook titled Friend Suggestions. In a line of semi-familiar faces was the name Spencer Petchman, below an overly pixelated logo of the superhero The Punisher. Maxwell immediately lurked about the profile, but could gain access to very little of his photos or posts due to privacy restrictions. He saw that he still lived in town, in a suburb on the outskirts of the North End. He could view 3 pictures from the past 7 years, each one displaying a new level of decay. "He looks awful," Maxwell said to himself, immediately feeling bad for even feeling the need to think that. Upon entering his apartment, Maxwell couldn't shake the curiosity toward Spencer's life, both genuine and pervasive. He thought about requesting him for a moment, but wasn't sure how it would come off. He scrolled once more through his profile and saw that he had 25 mutual friends. What the hell, Maxwell thought. We all grew up together. He hit send request and went to take a shower. Upon toweling off and beginning to dress, Maxwell saw the red notification indicating that Spencer had not yet accepted his request, but sent a message in reply. He opened it up. "Seriously? Fuck you. Look like you're doing fine after everything. Fuck off." It shouldn't have been a surprise. It was exactly the reason he had questioned even sending the request. Yet, still, it burned Maxwell deep down to know that Spencer held so much anger towards him. But the burn did not linger, rather, it shifted force. Maxwell then said out loud to no one, "No, fuck you. Your drunk-ass dad nearly killed me. Good riddance." Maxwell threw himself on the couch and gazed off into the cityscape. The glowing lights were such a natural backdrop at this point that it is surprising that he even noticed it there. The flicker, hovering just inches beyond the thick glass. Maxwell stood astonished at its return, another traveler of the past into this mundane night. It had not changed after all these years, or maybe it did. Was it not deeper in its hue, less yellow and turning towards red, like the last bit of fall leaves before the decay set in fully? Suddenly, Maxwell grew angry at the flicker. It had tormented him as a child, and now it thinks it can simply come back decades later to taunt him again. Maxwell ran into his kitchen and grabbed a broom. He popped open the corner window that vented just enough to let a breeze in and stuck out the handle in the direction of the flicker. He poked and prodded, and the flicker jolted back and forth. Maxwell laughed, dark and bitter. The flicker then shot into the sky up to the roofline. Maxwell could still see it there, suspended just out of reach from his broom. Incensed now, Maxwell stormed out of his apartment and up the stairs to the rooftop garden space directly above him. He stomped towards the edge and craned his neck over the wrought iron fence. The flicker was right there below him. "Hey!" Maxwell screamed into the din of the city night. The flicker serenely rose up, placing itself eye to eye with Maxwell. He took a breath and his body relaxed. The flicker grew in size, and just as that night not 2 decades ago, it was as though it looked right within Max. He reached out his hand over the black curve of the fencing, and just as his fingers touched the flicker, it began to fall from the sky, and Maxwell fell too, over the fence and 20 stories down onto the concrete. Maxwell died immediately upon impact, but he swears that he still saw the flicker floating above him, just in front of the entryway to his apartment building, as that familiar bitterness filled his throat, and darkness came over everything from here unto eternity. Neither of us have entirely recovered from the incident yet. I expect that we will in time, but it is still a little too recent. It happened a few months ago, when my boyfriend, Mark, and I decided to take a guided tour of a cavern whilst on holiday in Derbyshire. For your own safety and that of anyone who reads this, I won't give the exact location. It was a beautiful July day, sunny and warm, and we all took a cable car up to the visitor center in the late morning. We had eaten lunch and 2 ice creams each by the time our slot for the tour came up. I suppose we were both a little overexcited. The cave was huge, and it was beautiful. A few of the tunnels were man-made. It had been a flour spar mine during the Victorian era, but most of the openings that we could see from the main passage had been carved into rocks by flowing water over thousands of years. As we followed the tour, we deliberately hid at the back like naughty teenagers, repeatedly letting the rest of the group get ahead of us so we could explore the caverns on our own and take silly pictures. It was too far and too dark for any of them to turn out well, but we were having fun and feeling a little giddy. The tour guide had to return to where we were a few times to hurry us along. We lingered in a large chamber as the guide was distracted by a family with 2 young children, who decided that he was going to earn his wage that day by answering every question they had. They were all at a macabre age, it seemed, and were particularly interested in how many people had died down there and whether the caves might be haunted. Their parents stood by, smiling indulgently at their morbid little angels. "Well," said the guide, "there have been mining accidents down here. Conditions were quite dangerous back then. As to whether the place is haunted, I'll have to leave that for you to decide." He leaned down towards the children conspiratorially. "But some of the other guides have said that when they're down here alone, they can hear scraping in the walls." The children giggled, wide-eyed. Behind them, their mother dramatically clutched her hands to her chest and exclaimed, "Oh, how spooky." Beside me, I heard Mark give a snort of laughter. He and I were lurking near the back of the group again so that we could examine some of the pretty crystals that covered the walls in patches. The cavern had a few dim lights dotted throughout so that we could all see where we were going, but they were nowhere near illuminating enough to drive away the darkness. They were, however, different colors, giving the crystal a pleasant rainbow hue. We wanted more time to take pictures than we had been given, so we hid ourselves in the shadows whilst the group moved on to the next section. "Oh no," I said to Mark as we stepped laughing back onto the path. "Somehow we've been left behind again." I spent a few minutes taking photos, first of Mark doing comical poses and then of the crystals. Everything was coming out blurry, though, so I eventually gave up. "Come on, we better go," I said, tucking my phone back into my pocket. But Mark didn't follow me. He had wandered into a recess in the wall off the side of the path. A small area had been cornered off with a chest-high plastic barrier. I joined him beside it and looked down. There was a hole. A tunnel dropped straight down for 8 meters or so and then sharply curved off to the side. The light in the cavern was just bright enough for us to see down it. It was maybe a meter or so in diameter, easily big enough for a person to fit down. "Ooh," said Mark, grinning at me. "Spooky." I tugged his sleeve. "Leave the spooky stuff alone and let's go, or the guide will tell us off again." "If you were a proper adventurer," declared Mark, laughter in his voice, "you'd want to explore down there." "Fuck off," I exclaimed. "I'll leave that nonsense to the potholers and cave divers. Don't you remember that John Jones guy and how he died?" I knew he did. That story had messed me up for a while. Mark gave the plastic wall a little tug. There was clearly no real intent, he was just winding me up. But to both of our surprise, it lifted up completely and came away. "Oh," said Mark, standing there and holding it. "I didn't expect that." He placed it down against the wall and then gave me a huge smile. "It's like the universe wants us to go down there." I glanced down at the hole, feeling an unpleasant rush of vertigo at the drop and a little chill of fear at the darkness down there. "Come on," I pleaded, stepping away. "Don't mess around." He saw that I was genuinely a little distressed and softened. "I'm sorry, love. I was just messing around. Of course I remember John Jones." He turned to pick up the screen. "I'll just put this back and then we can..." But he didn't finish the sentence. As he reached to pick up the curve of plastic, his foot slipped on the wet rock, and with an awkward twist he tumbled into the hole. I cried out in fear and lunged forward to grab him, my hands clamping round one of his arms as he fell. I was nowhere near strong enough to catch him, but it seemed to slow him enough that he could grab onto the edge and prevent himself from disappearing completely into the darkness below.
I released his arm and instead twisted my fingers into the back of his shirt, hoping to help him as he tried to pull himself up. But I couldn't get enough of a grip. If I could just reach a little farther down and grab his belt, that might do it. But kneeling down at the side of the hole as I was, I felt a little precarious, and I was afraid that I would tip in too. Before I could start calling for help, something deeper in the hole caught my eye. Beyond Mark, right where the tunnel curved away into darkness, was a tiny glint of light. I stared at it in confusion. What was I seeing? My brain tried to tell me that it was just one of the lights reflecting off a crystal, but I rebelled against that, knowing that it was something else. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could finally make out what I was looking at. It was an eye. Down in that hole where the tunnel disappeared from sight, a face was peering up at me. Only half of it was visible, the rest hidden behind rock, but I could make out its two small pupils, a hole of a nose and a gaping smile, wider than seemed possible, splitting the face open. I could make out its large, flat teeth and the shine of saliva dripping down its chin. A violent shudder ran through me, and the only sound I could hear was my heart pounding in my ears. For a moment, I was completely paralyzed by fear. And then the face began to move out into the tunnel. With a cry of horror and my previous concerns immediately forgotten, I lunged forward to grab Mark's belt. I yanked on it, my muscles burning with the exertion, my eyes locked onto the thing in the hole. "Climb up," I said to Mark. Up, get up. Jesus Christ, you have to get out." Mark had no idea what was happening, but was clearly affected by my sudden terror. He began to scramble desperately against the wall, his feet pushing against the wet rock, wrenching himself up to try and get a purchase with his hands. I was trying to lift him, pulling him as hard as I could, but God, I was so weak and he was so heavy. My screams had become wails as we made no ground and that thing was getting closer. Still just a face in the dark, but climbing. Its split grin growing wider, coming closer and closer to my boy. And then, suddenly, Mark was rising up. I barely registered that there was other people there, other hands lifting him out. We were both dumped unceremoniously onto the floor, where we lay, beyond exhausted. I was almost oblivious to their concerned questions or the tour guide standing over me, angrily asking why we'd moved the screen and what we thought we'd been playing with. I just hung onto Mark and cried, my eyes still locked onto the hole in the rock and what might come out of it. But there was just darkness. Unsurprisingly, the tour was cut short and we were taken back to the entrance, given stern words and told not to come back. On the cable car ride back to the car park, Mark just held my hand in silence, and it wasn't until we were out on the other side that he finally asked me what I'd seen down there. I told him, even though I knew it sounded ridiculous. I didn't expect him to believe me. Out here in the bright sunshine, I was starting to doubt it myself. He paused for a moment. "It did seem," he said carefully, "that just before they pulled me out, I felt fingers on my ankle." I exhaled softly. Then I reached over and gripped his hand. We won't be visiting any more caves. I read all the horror stories about being lost underground, and have seen all the movies. I always said that they were dumb as hell. It was their own fault for going down there. They should have known better, and I vowed to never put myself in that silly situation, yearning to breathe free above the surface. It didn't help that we lived near a huge cave system, literally at the bottom of a local mountain, and an ancient river had cut holes all through the ground. People came from all over to explore, and we even had a minor celebrity or two lose their lives in our soil. Most of the town worked year-round in the business of serving tourists. Highly prepared, generally, and with all air of self-confidence and athletic builds, those all seemed too unafraid of the business in which they were engaged, diving into the pitch dark, squeezing through narrow corridors hundreds of feet beneath our toes. I would have moved to get away from the whole scene, but my house was cheap, and the neighbors were nice. I'd lived in the town my whole life.
Nobody ever fell into a sinkhole and ended up in a cave there, at least. My friends I'd likewise known for most of my life, and we enjoyed frequent drinking, and it led to a couple nights where I woke up without any memory of the evening before. I always ended up safely in bed, or sometimes passed out on my floor, with the sunlight streaming in directly strong and causing a full brain-pounding headache, or in a stranger's porch, or in a town jail's drunk cell. When we stayed past last call at the neighborhood bar and upset the staff, my friends were likewise heavy drinkers, and they also had nights where they blacked out drunk. We just took it as normal Fridays, and laughed about our debauchery, and we regaled each other with stories of past weekends. I felt that the ground was calling out to me for a couple of weeks before the incident. I would hear whispers when I was driving by the parking lots to one of the most visited caves, which opened into a complex system, and I dreamed that I was walking near the mouth of a great cave with stalagmites bearing out like giant teeth. I thought nothing of it, and not believing in prophecies like any logical 21st century man, but one dream was so bad I couldn't fall asleep the rest of the night. I had a flashlight in that dream, and I walked into the cave, and it was full of monsters. I awoke in a cold fright and felt them in the room with me. I had to turn on the lights, and when I closed my eyes, I felt their hot breath and heard their ragged breathing. The next Friday, I planned to get extremely drunk, to get a good night's sleep. The monsters had been in my room, in my mind, again the night after, and the night after that. I certainly met that goal, and we were all 3 sheets to the wind by 10:30, a rare evening indeed. I wandered out to the bar for a smoke and felt the chill of the November air. I heard the whispering again. It was plaintive and real. It was calling my name. I couldn't have resisted, as much as the rest of this might have been my fault. Could you resist someone calling your name? I didn't realize it was the voice of the cave. The monsters. They knew I would be here, close enough. Just close and unaware enough tonight. They called my name, and I followed. My name is John. I've always been an avid hiker and camper. Growing up, I was taught everything you need to know to survive in the woods. My father taught me how to shoot, hunt, and plenty of bushcraft. Recently, I had gotten into backpacking and really enjoyed it. I would try to go with my friends, but most of the time I ventured solo so I could go my own pace. After graduating college, I decided to go backpacking at a national park that I had always wanted to go to. In the Sierras, none other than Yosemite. So after telling family where I was going and getting everything I needed to survive out there for a few weeks, I made my way out. It's about a 10-hour drive, but I eventually made it, and my God, was this place beautiful. After a few days of hiking, everything went smoothly, and I even saw a few deer. I got some good fish, and I really enjoyed the great outdoors. Things started getting weird after the first 5 days. Normally the sound of bugs and little critters at night accompanied me, but there were moments where it was completely silent. Like absolutely no sound at all. What kind of spooked me was I was sometimes seeing weird lights in the distance that I thought were other backpackers, but it didn't look like normal lights from flashlights. More like orbs of lights moving around. Another few days passed and I ran into another hiker. Her name was Sandy and she was a pretty girl, 22, just like me. We made small talk and she asked if she wanted to hike together since we were going to the same route. I agreed and we spent a few days hiking together as a matter of fact. At night, during a campfire, I asked her if she saw any strange lights at night, and she said she thought she did and it took it as a distant backpacker. I didn't press on about it and just went on with the night. The next day, we went our separate ways since I decided I was going back to the lodge to stock up on supplies. I then made camp at the furthest campground near a family with a small child. This is where things got really, really weird. It was late night, the family was going to bed, and I was hanging out by my campfire having myself a few beers. Later, the fire became basically embers. I didn't want to go to bed yet, so I was just sitting outside enjoying the peaceful sounds of the night, when suddenly it went quiet. That same eerie quietness as before. Then I saw some movements by the family's camp. I couldn't really tell due to the distance and the dark, but I heard a zipper being undone. I made the decision to shine my flashlight near their campsite. Normally this would be rude, but something did not feel right, and I could have sworn I saw a figure of something near their tent. It couldn't have been the parents, since I saw them go to bed with their child when my fire was dying down. Once my light got near the figure, I saw something big. Like a bear, but it didn't look like a normal bear. Then, as I moved the light right on the tent, it had the child in its arm and darted out the campsite so fast, faster than anything that size could move. I was shocked, but I got my composure together very quickly and blew my survival whistle. Tent lights began to turn on from nearby as the family woke up, and what I could tell was a panic. "Where is he?" they would ask, referring to their child. I yelled that someone abducted him and joined them to go alert the parking ranger. A search and rescue was immediately started. I don't know if they ever found the child or not. All I did was give my side of the story, and once I was cleared, I went to my travels. I mean, I was getting tired when this happened, so it could have been a bear, but the way it had that kid in its arms, bears don't do that to people. I quickly left that area the following day, and though it was really hard for me, I hoped for the best for the family. This next story really creeped me out, not to the point where I ended my trip, but really made me question if I should continue on. It was late dusk. I was fishing near a river, hoping to get a few fish for dinner. Then, at the corner of my eye, I saw across the river those same lights in the sky, closer this time. I gazed back towards the river, and I shit you not, I saw what appeared to be two figures walking near the fire pit I made. They were skinny, about 7 feet tall, and had really big hands and making some sort of clicking sound. I noped the fuck out of there and decided I would camp elsewhere that night. Safe to say, I didn't sleep much that night. This is the last story I have of my trip that pretty much sealed the deal for me. Out of all the weird things I saw, I can't explain. I ran into Sandy by sheer luck, asked her how she was and if anything weird had happened since we went our separate ways. She said no and was kind of worried about my question and asked me what did I mean by weird. I told her about the family with the missing child, and she had the face of someone who just heard their family member got cancer. I didn't mention the entities by the river as I didn't want to frighten her. She said she and her friend Emily had been backpacking and were going to the top of some dome and asked if I wanted to join. I agreed, and we made our way to hike that day to the top of the dome peak. After a night of having a few drinks and good conversations, we all went to bed. In the middle of the night, I had to pee really badly, so I unzipped my tent. I got out and did my business, and right as I made my way back, I saw Emily just standing by the cliff looking out. I asked her what the hell she was doing, that it's so late, and she didn't say anything, but I have to go. I told her, go where? It's late. You really should go to bed. You don't get too close to the edge. You're gonna fall off. She only responded, I'm okay. Be back to bed soon. I found this whole conversation odd, but decided to just go back to bed. In the morning, I was awoken by Sandy. She was in a panicked tone and asked, John, where's Emily? I said, she's not in her tent. Maybe she went to look at the view. She was out last night doing that. But when we looked, she wasn't there. We could not find any trace of her friend. We looked for an hour in the woods nearby, calling for her name, but no answer. We were about to call an SOS when we came back to our campsite, and we saw Emily, right by the same cliff I saw her at last night. Sandy shouted, Emily, where did you go? We thought we lost you. Emily didn't respond. She looked like she was in a trance and began making her way closer to the edge of the cliff. Sandy said in a concerned voice, Emily, what are you doing? Get back here, you're getting too close to the... Right as she was at the edge, she broke out of her trance and turned her head to Sandy and back to her feet in a look of confusion. Emily said, What? Why am I outside my tent? She took a step back and turned to make her way back to us. Sandy spoke. What are you talking about, Emily? But after Emily took that first step back to us, I can't explain it other than one moment she was making her initial step to go back to our campsite, and the next she was flung straight into the air like a rag doll by some unknown force.
Emily screamed. I was in a state of shock, and then we heard a loud but distant thud. We didn't even bother to grab our gear. I just grabbed Sandy's hand and told her, "We need to leave, now." Sandy was shocked, tears in her eyes, but I brought her out of her state of shock by telling her to run. She managed to pull herself together, and we ran. We ran for what felt like hours, but eventually, we made it back to the lodge. The staff asked if everything was okay, and I just said in an out-of-breath tone, "Call the Rangers. Our friend fell off a cliff." It's been a few days since then. Sandy and I spoke to the Rangers and search and rescue personnel and told them where Emily had fallen. At first, they thought we could have had something to do with it, but given how far she fell off the cliff, or thrown, I should say, and us passing the polygraph test, we were cleared of suspicion. What was even more strange was the Rangers immediately dropped their investigation and began to call in the FBI. The sheriff sat me down and asked me simply, "Son, what really happened out there?" I couldn't hold it in any longer. I told him what really happened, and when he asked Sandy if this was true, she agreed. The sheriff took a long sigh and said, "That's what I figured. No way anyone could have pushed her that far off the cliff, let alone other things we found." I said, "Other things? What other things?" He only replied with, "That's none of your concern. The FBI will take over from here. I probably don't need to tell you this, but I highly advise you call the rest of your trip off." We were let go and given a hotel for the night to stay at and gather our composure. But before I left, I spoke to a search and rescue officer and I asked them if they found Emily, and she said they did, but it was strange. Having fallen off the cliff, one would think they would find her body in such a way it was clear they died from a fall. But he said they found her body, but that her eyes and tongue were completely gone. That's all I could get out of him. The following day, Sandy and I had exchanged contact information and went our separate ways. Before we left, she grabbed my hand and said, "I'm really glad to have met you, John. And I'm sorry our trip had to end this way, but I'm glad we made it out alive. I won't forget you. Please be safe." She gave me a hug, kissed my cheek, and got in her car and drove off. I since have been doing a lot of reading on missing person cases, primarily missing 411, and realized that there is a surge of missing people in this national park, as well as others. The incident with Emily is very similar to a few cases I had come across. I do still hike and backpack. Sometimes Sandy joins me, too, though even with my new perspective and safety measures, the way Emily was flung off of that cliff in Yosemite, I don't think I will ever go back. This happened a few years ago. I never brought this up to anyone who wasn't involved because I know how insane it sounds, but I want to put this story out there so at least people know this threat is real and what they can do if it comes for them. Honestly, if someone told me what I'm about to tell you, I'd probably just say they were desperate for attention. I'll let you decide for yourself. I'm from the American Southwest, in what was once the Navajo Nation, and that's where the story takes place. I was dating this girl, Gigi, at the time. I was 20 and she was 18 and had just graduated high school a month or two ago. One weekend, Gigi's grandparents went out of town and they asked Gigi if she'd watch their place while they were gone, mostly because they had a cat named Jake that her grandma absolutely adored. We'd been dating for close to a year at this point, so Gigi asked if I wanted to stay there over the weekend with her. I excitedly said yes, because I knew her grandparents lived in this extremely nice residential area called Kayenta. It's a very secluded area, maybe 15 minutes from the nearest part of town, out in a gorgeous, fertile part of the Great Basin Desert. Every home in Kayenta has about a half-acre of property to it, so the houses were kind of far apart. It's also worth noting that there wasn't a single home in Kayenta worth less than $1 million. They were very nice homes. So Gigi and I drove out to her grandparents' house in the desert the first night they were gone, and I was just in awe of the house. It was a very beautiful adobe-style home with Mexican ceramic tile floors and genuine Navajo tapestries decorating the walls. There were a lot of rooms, too. a main living room area with a fireplace, a dining room, kitchen, a library, a den where her grandparents watch TV, a bedroom, bathroom, then the master bedroom with a private porch, the master bath, and a private shower room connected to the master bedroom. One of my favorite things about the house was how many windows there were. In the kitchen and living room, nearly every wall was entirely made of windows, so you could always take in the gorgeous desert view. We found Jake curling up on the couch in the den. He's a large black cat with green eyes and was very friendly. There was a door to the outside in the den, and it had a little cat flap in it, so Jake could go explore the desert and come back as he wished. We made sure he had some food and water, and then I wanted to check out more of the property. While we were walking around the sandy hills surrounding the house, I pulled out a joint I had brought. Gigi and I both liked smoking, so we got very high as we watched the sun start to set. Sunsets in the desert are some of the most beautiful. The sky turns into a painting palette of colors. The bright orange sun creates pink streaks that glow across the purple sky. It was beautiful, but suddenly we got this weird feeling of being exposed out in the open desert.
Do you feel weird being out here?
She asked me. What do you mean?
Just this place is so vast. Anything could be out here. It's like the hills have eyes or something.
I chuckled at that. Only thing out here are coyotes and retired seniors, maybe a cougar. But Gigi insisted that she had a weird feeling like we weren't alone in the desert. She agreed it was probably just an animal, but it was getting dark anyway, so we decided to go back to the house. Plus, Gigi said she knew where her grandmother kept some alcohol. We got back inside and rummaged the pantry until we found a handle of Bacardi. It was big enough that we figured we could drink a pretty fair amount of it before making a noticeable dent. We both took a couple shots and then mixed some with orange juice to sip on. Gigi's grandma had a lot of books about the Navajo people, about their traditions and beliefs, and about their superstitions. I opened a few of them just to look at the pictures inside. One that caught my attention was a book about Yinaldoshi, or Skinwalker. I'd heard about them growing up, the shapeshifters in Navajo folklore, supposedly witches who were once human, and their ultimate goal is to kill a person and wear its skin, so it can feel like a human again. I picked it up and opened to a random page where I saw a picture of a demonic-looking creature, like a twisted wolf with big antlers. I remembered one time a Navajo girl in my class was getting mad because we were talking about them. She said that simply mentioning them attracted their attention. Looking at this picture, I could understand why she would be afraid. I only read about half a page and decided that was enough. By now the sun had completely gone down, and I started to wish there were curtains for all those windows in the house. It was pitch black in the desert, and with the lights turned on in the house, the windows basically turned into mirrors. We can no longer see outside, but whatever is on the outside can still see in. It made me think about skinwalkers and what Gigi said earlier, about how she felt that there was something in the desert with us. And suddenly I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I told myself it was just a stoned paranoia, though, and Gigi and I watched some TV in the den. After about 30 minutes, Gigi said,
"Hey, are you hungry?"
I said yeah, and she told me there's a Costco pizza in the freezer out in the garage. She asked me if I'd go get it. I said sure. A trip to the garage was a small price to pay for Costco pizza. Now, mind you, the garage isn't connected to the house. It's a detached garage about 10 yards away on the property. So I go out to the kitchen door and walk the 10 yards to the garage. I get the pizza, and I'm on my way back when I hear what sounds like an animal in the sagebrush. At this moment, I remember that we haven't seen Jake since we first got to the house, and I want to make sure it's not him, since he should definitely be inside at this time of night. There are coyotes around, after all. I take out my phone and shine a flashlight in the direction of the noise I hear. Jake? I call out in a friendly voice. Here, kitty kitty. Then an animal emerged from the brush. For a second I thought it was a coyote, but I realized this animal was much too large. It looked almost like a dog, but it wasn't any kind of dog I'd ever seen. The sight of it actually really creeped me out.
But I know you're not supposed to panic or run from predators, so I calmly walked to the door. Its eyes followed me as I backed up to the house, but as soon as I slid the glass door open, it started running towards me. I freaked out and got inside as quickly as I could, and I locked the door right as it got up to the glass. It stared at me for a moment before walking away, and its eyes looked so strange to me, almost human-like. And as it turned around, the porch light caught it, and I swear I could see antlers on its head. My heart was racing. Hey, Gigi, I called out to my girlfriend. I think she could hear the stress in my voice because she came out quickly, looking worried. I looked at her, prepared to tell her about the weird creature, but then I remembered something else. Where's Jake? The look in her eyes said, oh shit, realizing she hadn't seen him in a while either. We tore the house apart looking for him, searching in every one of the many rooms. We were panicking so hard. This cat was the whole reason Gigi was staying at my grandparents' in the first place, and her grandma would absolutely freak out at her if we lost it. She probably wouldn't talk to her for a couple of months. She really loved that cat. We searched the living room, bedrooms, bathrooms, and den. We looked under every couch and mattress in the house. I was so panicked. I'd honestly forgotten about the strange experience I'd just had with that animal. I had just peeked inside the shower room when I heard a faint sound. I ran back out from the master bedroom and saw Jake sitting in the porch light outside the kitchen door I had just come in through. I took a sigh of relief. Hey, I found him, I shouted to Gigi. I opened the sliding door and let Jake inside. He brushed his head up against my shins and meowed softly at me. Gigi ran into the room and picked him up and let out her own sigh of relief. After this, we just settled down and watched more TV in the den. We were both a little drunk at this point, and we started making out on the couch, being sure to keep an eye on Jake so he didn't disappear again. After a few minutes of this, we heard what sounded like the cat flap in the door. We looked down at the flap and saw Jake. But Jake was already sitting on the other couch in the den. We could see him right there. Something wasn't right. The cat by the door started making weird growling noises at Jake, hissing and puffing up its tail. Then Jake jumped down from the couch and the two cats lunged at each other, screaming and clawing and biting. Not in a playful way either, in a serious, I want to kill you kind of way. I stood up and yelled at them, which seemed to scare them both, and they stopped fighting long enough for me to pick one of them up and go into the other room. I wasn't sure if I picked up Jake or the intruder cat, so I had Gigi look at both of them, and she couldn't tell the difference either. They were identical black cats. In order to figure out which one was which, we stayed in different rooms and studied both cats' behaviors. My cat was friendly and kept brushing up against me, trying to get me to pet it, so I was pretty sure I had Jake. I asked Gigi how her cat was doing, and she said he was acting very skittish. Confident we had identified which cat was Jake, we shooed the other cat out through the door in the den, and then blocked the cat flap so it couldn't come back in. Do you smell that? Gigi asked. I hadn't noticed it until she pointed it out, but then I got hit by a very weird and off-putting scent in the den. It honestly smelled like something had died in the room. What is that? I think it's from them fighting, I said. Cats release a pheromone when they're in danger. This must be what it smells like. It's disgusting. I had to agree. It was pretty gross, so bad that we could no longer stand to be in the den. We grabbed Jake and took him out into the living room where we continued to watch TV. Jake just wouldn't leave me alone either. He kept getting on my lap and meowing for me to pet him, and I gladly obliged until he seemed satisfied. As the night was winding down, Gigi said she was going to take a shower. I said okay, just planning to watch more TV. Gigi went to the shower room, and Jake decided he'd had enough of me and followed her. I heard the shower turn on, but then, a minute later, Gigi walked out of the room, saying there were no more towels, and she'd have to go back in the den. She plugged her nose before entering and giggled a little bit. I wished I could go back in the den, because these windows were still creeping me out. That weird animal never left the back of my mind, but I tried my best to distract myself by just watching TV. After a minute, I heard Gigi call out from the shower. Hey, I replied. What's up? In a surly voice, she said, Come join me. I suddenly got really excited thinking about having sex in that shower room. She didn't have to tell me twice. I got off the couch, but then I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I looked at it and saw I'd just gotten a text from Gigi. "Don't go in there," it said. I was frozen in place. I realized Gigi had never gone back to the shower room. She was still in the den looking for a towel. I looked over to the door of the den and cracked open slowly. I held my breath, waiting to see what came out of there. I half expected the demonic horned dog from that Skinwalker book to come creeping out to devour me. I could feel myself shaking. Slowly, Gigi emerged from the den, and I could see she was terrified, her skin colorless and her eyes wide with fear. She was clutching a six-shooter and trembling. She nodded at me to head for the front door. Quietly, I inched towards it, but I was much closer to it than she was. By the time I got there, she was only halfway across the floor. We heard that thing call out from the shower again in a sweet, sing-song voice. "Don't keep me waiting." I gulped and felt sweat drip down my brow as Gigi picked up the pace. She was only a few feet away when I heard the sound of wet footsteps coming out of the shower. I suddenly was unable to breathe, hearing the footsteps get closer. It was as if I could feel my life about to end. It peered its head around the corner, and my heart stopped in my chest. It looked just like Gigi. Same black hair, same face, same freckled skin. I wouldn't have been able to tell the difference, except its eyes immediately turned to the darkest black. I let out a weak, pathetic scream as it started running. Skin was replaced by feathers. A crown of antlers broke through its hairline, and it opened its mouth so wide its cheeks split open. Then I heard the loudest sound I'd heard in my life. The creature suddenly fell to the floor, screaming and writhing. There was a hole in its chest that looked like it was already beginning to rot. Gigi grabbed my arm and pulled me out the front door. Sitting just outside was Jake, or what used to be Jake. His body had been mutilated and partially eaten. We didn't waste any time in getting the fuck out of there. I drove through the desert as fast as I could. "What did you do?" was the first question out of my mouth. Gigi was still taking deep breaths and staring wide-eyed at nothing. "What was that thing?" Gigi explained that her grandma was very superstitious about the old Navajo legends. She held up the revolver she brought out from the den. "My grandma keeps it loaded with silver-capped bullets, and inside is a pocket of ash. Ash and silver are supposedly the only things that can hurt a skinwalker, and thankfully, it bought us enough time to get out of the desert alive that night. I'll never forget that night for the rest of my life, but that's actually not where this story ends. On the way out of the desert, Gigi called her grandma in a fit of hysteria. Through her tears, she managed to explain what happened. There was a long silence, and then her grandma said they'd come back early tomorrow, and told us to keep the gun close and just go back to Gigi's apartment for tonight. We got to the apartment and tried our best to sleep, but we were utterly terrified of what we just experienced. Every little noise set us off. We were worried maybe it was able to follow us somehow. Eventually, the morning rolled around, and Gigi's grandma came to pick us up. We didn't really question it. We just got in the car with her. But after a few minutes, we noticed we were headed back to Kayenta. "What are you doing?" Gigi asked. "You're not going back there, are you?" "Why not?" her grandma said. "It's my home, not theirs." She explained that she had felt this creature stalking her for some time now. She thought it had gone away when she didn't notice it for several months. That's why she was comfortable asking Gigi to watch the house for her. She also said she knew how to get rid of it for good, now that it's bold enough to try and claim her home. As we pulled up to the garage, we drove past Jake. The pain on her grandma's face was clear, but if anything, it only strengthened her resolve. Gigi and I hesitantly got out of the car once we parked. "Stay right there," her grandma warned. She pulled out a container of salt and drew a circle around us. "This will keep it out for a while." She asked Gigi to hand over the gun, checking the rounds, and cocked back the hammer. Then she cried out, "Mako!" She stared at the garage door, waiting for something. We waited anxiously as well. "Mako!" she yelled. Still nothing.
Mako! 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 After the 7th call, Jake emerged from the desert and walked into the garage with us. He meowed sweetly and looked at Gigi's grandmother. She responded by pointing the gun at it. You cursed, wretched beast. You've stalked me for years. Her voice was oddly calm and low. You were here first, so I was willing to ignore you for a while, knowing you couldn't hurt me if I didn't invite you into my home. The cat started circling our ring of salt, laughing. But now you've invaded my home and turned your eyes on my granddaughter. It's time for you to go. I know your name. Its laughing intensified, far louder than any sound a cat would be capable of making. Antlers started growing from its head. The grandma fired a single shot into the beast's skull and yelled, Cease, Chili! I never heard a more horrifying sound. The cat violently morphed into a coyote, then a cougar, then a stag, all the while screaming a terrible scream until its grotesque body finally turns back into a feathered old man. The wound festered and black smoke spilled out as the skin around it burned and fell off the monster's face. It turned away and ran out of the garage, running back into the desert. What'll happen to it? Gigi asked. It'll suffer greatly. Speaking the birth name of Maicho is the only way to truly extinguish it. In 3 days, it'll die a death more agonizing than you or I could imagine. Gigi and I felt every muscle in our body relax, knowing this thing could never harm us. Since then, I've moved north and don't have much interest in returning. I'm sure whatever magic created the Skinwalkers can be found here, too. But the desert just doesn't feel safe to me anymore. This past October, I had worked at a haunt. That is, a haunted attraction at a local theme park. I was pretty good at managing the big crowds, but what I really enjoyed was when the crowds would get smaller, and groups of 10 to 20 people were coming into my attraction. During times when the crowds were thin like that, I loved scaring them with stories and legends I knew about, and one of my favorite legends to tell them were the Skinwalker legends. I would start off greeting the group and tempting them with the offer to tell them all a story, asking them if they would like to hear a local legend, as we live in the desert, and this haunt was tucked away in the heart of miles of desert land. When they would agree, I would start my tale. Some of you may know about skinwalkers, and for those of you that do, you might know that native Navajo and Hopi tribes are fearful to even speak of this creature, or to even utter its name. These monsters span from South Arizona all through to New Mexico and the Mexican border, and across the lands of the native peoples. The Navajo believe them to be witches or shaman, an evil being with a supernatural power to shapeshift, typically by wearing the skins or masks of the animals they wish to walk as, a practice which is looked down upon by the Navajo people. This power is gained after killing a close relative or sibling, and imbues the being with many dark powers. The animal they appear as, however, always looks wrong. A deer or coyote that stands on its hind legs and walks as a man does. A crow or owl that has a face or eye that looks too human to belong to the animal they mimic, and that glow red in the moonlight. In all the legends, it says there is always one sure way to identify a skinwalker. A skinwalker, no matter what, will never be able to move as the creature it appears as in its animal form. Skinwalkers are able to do other things as well. They can move at seemingly impossible speeds and can mimic the voice of people, crying babies, your friends or loved ones, voices you would trust. They will lure you into the forest or into the pitch black of the nighttime desert. And once they have you isolated, and you lay your eyes upon their face, it is said you will die an agonizing death. Skinwalkers can curse people and cause them great suffering. Often it is said that they use a mixture that some call corpse powder when seen in their human form, which turns your tongue black and causes violent convulsions until you die. The worst part about skinwalkers, the reason native people dare not speak of it, It is believed that a skinwalker is capable of reading your minds, and the more aware of them you are, the more aware they become of you. So try not to think about it. But if on your ride home you can see a coyote in your path, or hear the drums of native people echoing loudly throughout the darkness, take care to drive quickly, and pray it will not pursue you. And at the end of it, I would almost always be met with looks of horror and fear. It was my absolute favorite tale to tell for this reason. I would tell this story over and over to as many groups as I could. It wasn't a good idea to talk about them. I would say as much with each recounting of the legend, and much less in the middle of the desert, surrounded by inky blackness that engulfed everything the park's lights didn't illuminate. But I did. I felt safe. Nothing would happen to me. It was just a legend. That was until I drove home after my shift, around 1 a.m, after a night of telling this particular story dozens of times to guests. As I drove through the twists and turns of the pitch-black mountainous desert road I traveled each night to go home. My high beams on, penetrating the darkness just enough for me to see the road and the first layer of brush on either side of it. My headlights shone on an animal, a coyote. At first I thought it was just the angle the light had hit it at that made it appear to have no tail, but as I continued driving, I encountered the animal again 3 times, each within several miles of each sighting, a distance any normal animal wouldn't be able to make, especially when running against a car going 65 miles an hour for most of the journey. Each time I would scan the road for wildlife, and I would see it, there, just outside the darkness. The coyote with no tail, staring at me from the side of the road. My stomach churned a bit, and I breathed deep, trying to tell myself I was just imagining things. The coyotes had tails, and none of them were the same animal. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But I knew, deep down, I was lying to myself. I knew I was wrong. I knew it wasn't real. And it was terrifying. I'm relieved to say I made it home safely that night, but still, every now and then, when I drive through the desert in the darkness of night, or glance out my bedroom window into the blackness, I can see that coyote, that skinwalker. I hope it never decides I know too much, but I think that maybe, just maybe, it visits me to remind me of its presence, that it wants me to continue telling this story, to continue spreading awareness of their presence, so that it can claim the lives of those who are weak-minded enough to fall prey to it. And now that you know the story, maybe it will come after you. Back in college, a buddy and I were hanging out in our dorm room, smoking some weed and chilling. We get on the topic of creepypastas and stuff like that. I mentioned that I've heard some really creepy Skinwalker stories. My buddy gets really quiet out of nowhere. I saw one once, up close and personal. That shit's real, bro. Of course, I asked him to tell me more. He said he didn't like talking about it, but eventually he opened up. So his story took place back in the summer before he left for college. Him and his high school friend group had planned a big last hurrah camping trip. He was from Southdale, Arizona, and I think he said they only drove a good hour and a half outside the city to one of their friend's parents' ranching properties. There's about 8 people in their group, and everyone shows up around the same time in 3 separate cars. Around when they show up, it's already starting to get dark, so they set up their tents and a campfire and start drinking and smoking. This one dude in their group, let's call him Tim, is being a little more quiet than usual. My buddy asked him what's wrong, and he said something along the lines of, "I don't feel good, just a little under the weather today." Regardless, they start making brats and all having a good time. Then, out of nowhere, everyone notices Tim is gone, just totally vanished. Nobody even saw him leave, even though everyone was relatively close to the fire. The group started calling his name, thinking that he's pranking everyone. Then they start to get worried once Tim has been gone for over an hour. So my friend and a couple others go out into the hills to search for him. They walk around for a good 15 minutes, calling his name before they finally get a response. It's not Tim. Instead,
They hear the familiar howl of a coyote, and it's answered by a couple of other coyotes. My buddy says he was a little worried at this point that Tim might have gotten dragged off by the wild animals. Everyone in their group was paranoid because there's no way Tim could have gone missing without anyone noticing. Just no way. They heard another howl suddenly. It's longer than the others, and different in that it sounds off, like if someone had a recording of a coyote howling and decided to play it. My friend's blood ran cold when the howl ended in a sort of hacking laughter. And unlike the howl, the laughter sounded close, like 20 feet away close. The group started frantically looking around, convinced Tim is out there fucking with him. He isn't. They don't see anyone. They return to the fire a little shaken up. Everyone is really starting to get worried at this point. The group starts considering calling the police when suddenly a truck pulls up to the campsite. It's Tim's truck. Tim says he's sorry. He got off work 2 hours late and hurried out to the ranch as fast as he could. This is when the group realized that Tim didn't carpool there with anyone. As if on cue, they hear another long, drawn-out howl, just like the other one. At that point, the group noped the fuck out of there. They ended up paying to camp at a designated campground, and the night went on as normal. But my friend still says he thinks about when he asked Tim if he was alright. He claims that at the time he could definitely tell something was off about Tim, but didn't think anything of it. But now he's 100% convinced that Tim was some sort of Skinwalker entity, impersonating his friend for shits and giggles. How the creature knew what Tim sounded and looked like, well, he has no explanation for that. Maybe he just got inside their heads.
When the ship capsized, it was all I could do to keep my head above the water. I couldn't call out for anyone. I couldn't grab anything. I just pushed upwards and spit out seawater as the waves broke over me. Again and again I braced for the wave, felt it pull me under, and I surfaced with a gasp, the deafening storm once again ringing in my ears. I don't know for how long this continued. Maybe a half hour, an hour, hours? I can't say. But by the time the storm subsided and the waves became manageable, I was tired beyond measure. It was still nighttime, hopefully approaching the morning, but I saw no light on the horizon. I called out for my friends and heard nothing in response. I scanned the moonlit sea as I floated, and saw refuse from the yacht that seemed to have been carried by the current with me. And so, with what little remained of my strength, I slowly inched my way towards anything floating, not swimming, but merely treading water against the currents as things passed me. Counter to my luck thus far, I found one of the larger storage cases that had been on deck, and though I couldn't entirely support my weight, it was soundly sealed, and I draped myself over it, resting my arms. I carried on this way for hours until morning, and when the sun did finally rise, I saw land in the distance. And as I watched it get larger in the morning light, I realized the current was carrying me towards it. Eventually I heard the waves breaking on the shore. I heard the seagulls crying overhead, and the sounds kept the exhaustion at bay, giving me hope. By this point I lamely held on to the container. The gentle slapping of the water against my face kept me awake. I soon felt myself being pulled back and forth, the waves getting fiercer, and with one last crash, the container was thrown from my grasp, and I felt the sand against my knees. I crawled up the shore, away from the hot sand, and rested against a tree at the edge of a woodline. My body felt like lead, and for a while I just lay there, watching the waves push debris ashore. I watched as the sun marked its passing, eating away at the shade until it lit up my face, and I shielded my eyes, and as I looked to the shade of the next closest tree, I saw a red flare go up like a firework in the distance, slightly over the tree line. Immediately, the exhaustion fled from my body, and my mind regained the clarity the night had sapped away. Rescue. Nearly half a day had passed, and it made sense there would be a search party when we didn't return after the storm last night. I strained my eyes on the flare, trying to get a distance on the burning red star as it hung there in the blue midday sky. It was far away, perhaps a mile or more, and it didn't line up with the beach I was on. I had to head towards it, though my spirits were raised, my body ached more than ever, and as I made to stand, white-hot pain shot up my right leg. I cried out and collapsed.
Through gritted teeth and watering eyes, I looked at my swollen red and purple ankle. The numbness from cold and strain had worn off, and the pain flooded my body. I did not know if it was broken or how, but it ached me terribly, and it was all I could do to crawl. I looked for some kind of branch or debris I could use as a crutch, and I eventually came across a short stick, perhaps the size of a cane. With the thought of the flare still in my mind, I hobbled up to the beach towards it as best I could. It was soon no longer in the sky, but the last vestiges of smoke from where it had burned away still lingered. I assumed the beach would wrap around the island, if it was an island at all, and so I kept following the sand. I hobbled and winced and was forced to take several breaks, so great was the pain. Even while trying to keep the weight entirely on the stick, I could barely go 100 meters without needing to stop. Onward I trekked, and I began calling out for help. The beach seemed endless, and if it curved, it was at such a slight angle that it was unnoticeable. Still I walked and at times crawled onward, calling for help, eventually keeping my eyes on the water for boats or listening for the sound of an engine. When the sun began to set, the pain and exhaustion were too much for me. I sat down on the beach, my throat sore from yelling, and my body aching from the swim and journey thus far. My mental state fared little better. The pain was still grating on me. The frustration of not finding the rescue party or whoever had fired the flare left me with a sense of helplessness. I watched the sun setting, and as I readied my lungs for one last shout for help, my voice caught in my throat. I wasn't alone on the beach anymore. The man was massive, maybe 6.5 feet tall. His muscles ripped under his tanned skin as he leveled his spear at me. He must have approached me like a cat, so quiet were his movements to get within 2 meters of me. His hair was roughly cut, hanging about his face unevenly, and his beard was long and overgrown. Both were patchwork of brown and gray. He wore torn pieces of cloth like a belt, covering himself, the rest of him covered only by freckles and scars. Stiffly, he moved the spear nearer my throat.
"What is your name?"
he asked. The situation was so sudden and overwhelming. This man was obviously no part of a rescue party. Were there other people here? He spoke English just now, hadn't he? 100 and more questions pushed and shoved within my mind, all trying to be the first to ask, but I simply sat there, mouth agape, my eyes fixated on how sharp the spear point looked up close. "Do you understand me?" he asked me. He said each word slowly. I nodded quickly. "What is your name?" He empathized the question with his spear, and the look in his eyes genuinely frightened me. I gave him my name, and a rush of apologies and questions followed it. "Where are we? I was shipwrecked. Did you fire the flare? I've been He cut me off with a laugh. I could see the tension disappear from his body. His spear gave way. He smiled at me and attempted to help me stand, and when that failed, he took to examine my ankle while he answered my questions. We were on a long but narrow island. He had seen the flare too and had come to investigate when he heard me shouting. He lived here alone, and apparently had for some time. As for his name, he refused to give it, even after I pointed out that I have given him mine. "It's not important that you know it," was all I got out of him. He finished examining my ankle and gazed at the setting sun. His lips moved silently, and I got the notion he was figuring the time. He turned back to me and said that he would be right back. As soon as he left me and went back into the woods, exhaustion washed over me. I leaned back in the sand to stretch and must have fallen asleep instantly. When I awoke, I had to blink several times to make sure my eyes were actually open. It was pitch black all around me. The air was wet and clammy, and from the sound I made as I sat up, I got the notion I was indoors. I had been lying on a firm mat of some sort, and as I felt around, my hands could only find smooth, uneven stone. I could barely see the high, uneven ceiling and sloped walls. A nearby spire of rock seemed to reach almost all the way up, surrounded by some smaller, similar spires. I realized I was in a cave. I stretched a bit and felt a tightness on my injured leg.
My hands traced the wooden splints that ran from my knee to my foot. I had lost my shoes in the water, but the man had removed my socks and applied some kind of ointment or cream. Just having touched it, I soon felt my fingertips go numb. I managed to stand, unable to feel the pain, and slowly moved along the cave wall, looking for light. I soon found I had been very near the cave entrance, just around a slight bend, and as I moved into the cave doorway, I let the morning sunlight wash over me. "You slept for over a day," he said. I nearly leapt out of my skin. He had been just outside the cave, to the side, in a flattened dirt clearing. There he sat, not looking up at me, gutting a fish on a flat stone. "I was worried. You must be thirsty." He stood and smiled at me, and gently he went to the edge of the clearing and, with a ladle, carefully filled a clay cup from a larger clay pot of water. "Here," he said as he handed it to me. I took the cup from him and greedily drank the clean, crisp water, and as soon finished, he took it from me and ladled more water into it. We did this 2 more times before I was satisfied, and I thanked him. "We'll eat soon. Do you like fish?" We sat around a small fire outside the cave, away from the dirt clearing, and this time he asked me most of the questions. I told him of the trip of my friend's small yacht, of the storm, of how I had come to wash up on the island. I told him of my friends that had been on the boat with me, of James and his inheritance that had given rise to a sudden interest in boating. I told him of Ben and Lori, and how they, fresh from their honeymoon on a cruise ship, had indulged James in another immediate trip at sea. I spoke of some other random things of home, and noted his interest in them. He asked me questions on things every so often, about technology especially, and when I showed him the ruined cell phone from my pocket, I watched his face as he held it, and a thought occurred to me. "How long have you been on this island?" I asked. He raised his eyebrows at the question, and handed the cell phone back. "What year is it? Do you know?" he asked. I told him. He simply nodded and began throwing more sticks on the fire. Eventually he spoke. "A while. I've been on this island a long while," he said. "How long is a long while?" I pressed him. He sighed and tilted his head up, eyes closed. I saw his lips move faintly as he counted again. "Almost 30 years, he said, and began to get up. 30 years? Are you joking?" I got up to follow him, and he walked back towards the clearing. "You mean to tell me you've been here for nearly 30 years alone? No one has come for you? This can't be that far from civilization if I washed up here from a day trip," I said. He stopped and turned to me, allowing me to catch up to him. "No, there were others with me, and I am here by choice." "Others? So where are they now?" I asked, following him again to the clearing. An emotion, a frustration or something close to it, started to creep onto his face. "They were killed," he said, "by a monster." I didn't reply. It was the sort of answer you give to a child asking too many questions. I sat there by the edge of the clearing on a log as I watched him. He rinsed the rock he had used as a cutting board and washed his knife that was so thin it must have been sharpened thousands of times. I watched as he examined and replaced food in the ancient clay pots. All of these things in the routine so uniformly done with such ancient tools. Could he really have been here for 30 years? Eventually he finished his cleaning and turned to me as if to say something, but hesitated. He thought for another moment, and then went to pick up the huge spear he had left leaning by the cave entrance. "Don't go anywhere. Just rest today," he said. "I'm going to look for your friends." I nodded to him, and he started off down the small hill that led up to the cave. He paused and turned back to me after a moment. "Keep the fire lit so it smokes." He pointed to the pile of wood and leaves by the dirt clearing. "If your friends show up, make them stay here too." And he turned again to leave. What if something else shows up? I called after him, jokingly, gesturing broadly to the island around us.
Then go in the cave. Stay there,
he said. The seriousness of his tone caught me off guard. And even from a distance, I could see the dark look on his face. I resolved to stay near the cave. When he eventually returned around sunset, he was alone. To my surprise, he had hauled back the container I had used as a flotation device. He had some other small things I assumed he scavenged from the beach. Bits of metal and a pane of glass I recognized as from one of the yacht windows, remarkably unbroken. A porcelain mug, broken and what appeared to be a length of wire. These he put away in various jugs and jars. The life-saving container itself had filled with fruits and what appeared to be some kind of root vegetable. Some of these comprised our dinner, and afterwards he applied more of his numbing ointment to my leg and adjusted the splint a bit. When the sun was almost to the horizon, he ushered me into the cave and lit what seemed to be a grass wick in a small clay dish of oil or fat. It served as a surprisingly bright candle, and I saw that the inside of the cave, despite being rather narrow, was actually also somewhat furnished. There were crude wooden panels on some of the more uneven parts of the floor and the walls, and eventually a makeshift door into another dark area.
"Wait here,"
he said, and left me with the candle before going into the door and closing it behind him. After a moment, he returned with a large, solid wooden pillar. He closed the door and then took the candle from me as we headed back to the entrance of the cave. He then left the giant piece of wood with me and went outside, bringing in the pot of water. Afterwards, he slowly rolled an enormous stone in front of the cave entrance. It blended into the cave wall so well I hadn't noticed it until then. It was massive and flat. It must have been unimaginably heavy. Eventually, when the stone finally slid into the well-worn groove it must have etched over the course of decades, the man slid the large wooden pillar into a small groove in the ground, angling it so that it held the stone in place. With that, he unrolled a woven grass mat behind the stone, and wordlessly, with his spear at his side, he lay down to sleep. It wasn't until he turned to blow out the makeshift candle that he seemed to remember me.
"Ah, sleep where you did last time. Don't come near the door."
And that was it. He blew out the candle, leaving me in the dark. That night I slept restlessly. I dreamed of drowning and woke up to the dull pain of my leg aching. I hobbled out of the cave and saw by the sun that the day was into mid-morning already. As I went out into the light and I saw my savior in the dirt clearing, spear in hand, his body tense. Viciously, the spear snapped at some unseen enemy in front of him. Over and under, around and above, the spearhead glinted blindingly fast as it caught the sunlight. I stood in awe. The man stepped forward, pulling the spear back as he moved, and then thrust it forward like lightning. It seemed to cut the very air itself. His muscles strained as the heavy spear whirled, cutting the leg from the invisible enemy. Then around it came once more, blindingly fast, to sever the imaginary neck. He seemed to relax suddenly. As he turned to begin his practice again, he saw me standing there. I went to him and exclaimed my amazement. He simply nodded humbly as he returned to his sparring, and he spoke to me of the dangers of the island, of snakes, spiders, plants to avoid. He answered some of my questions, and then, as if on cue, a wild boar appeared squealing by the woodline. He sighed, and before I could say anything, the spear was out of his hand, whistling through the air. It struck the boar so hard that it was knocked backwards, dead instantly. It all happened so fast that when I turned to him, he answered my question before I asked it.
"They don't come here often, but they do dig up my vegetables."
And he went to retrieve his weapon. I followed him over to the animal, and he swept the blood from the spear. The boar was larger than I had thought. "I guess that's meat for quite a while, huh?" I said. To my surprise, he looked at me with disgust.
"No,"
he replied, and hefted the huge boar up on his shoulder, holding it by the back legs. "What?" Why not? I asked. He paused at this and seemed to hesitate before answering.
It's not the right kind of meat. Not for eating.
And he began to carry the boar into the woods. You're serious? I called after him.
Yes,
he replied, pushing through the undergrowth, the boar trailing blood behind him. The rest of the day I passed alone. I pondered how easily the man had killed the boar and how good it might have tasted. My entire body still ached badly from the strain of the swim to the island and from sleeping on an uneven stone floor, and I barely walked at all. I investigated the contents of the jar and pots, finding mostly dried and smoked food, some odds and ends, bits of metal, and an assortment of noticeably worn-out tools. Eventually, the man returned before sundown. To my dismay, he was alone. He had gathered some more debris, a large collection of broken boards, which he spent that evening painstakingly pulling the nails out with a stone wedge. We talked little, and we ate fruits and dried fish for dinner before eventually retiring to the cave. Again he sealed it, and again he slept in front of it, bidding me sleep further in. Once more I slept fitfully, imagining James's voice calling out to me, louder and louder, until I woke up to it. I was really hearing it. He was calling for me. It was soft, but I could hear it. It was unmistakably James's voice. Over and over, he repeated my name, asking if I was there. I managed to stand and follow it towards the mouth of the cave, and I saw the man sitting on his sleeping mat facing the stone door, a candle lit by his side, spear resting in his lap. James's voice resounded through the stone blockade in front of him. "James!" I shouted. The man jumped up, startled, and the voice outside stopped for a moment, then began calling my name even louder. I hobbled to the door quickly, but before reaching it, the man blocked me. "That's my friend out there," I said, and moved to get past him. Again, he blocked me.
"That's not your friend,"
he said. "What? Yes, it is. That's James. I told you." The man slapped his hand over my mouth. Again, I heard James calling for me.
"It's me. Are you okay? Can you hear me? I can't get in. Are you all right in there?"
He shouted through the stone. I struggled against the man's grasp, but he held me still. His grip was like steel, his face pressed close to mine.
"That is not your friend."
The words escaped through his gritted teeth like a hiss. He had kept his voice low on purpose, so James couldn't hear us.
"That was drawn here by the death of the boar. It's why we stay in here every night. I don't care what it says. Do not speak to it."
I pushed away from him, and he let me go. I caught my breath and looked at him. I saw his dark face, illuminated by the flickering of the candle. He was serious. For a moment, I hesitated, and we both listened as James continued to shout for me. It was unmistakable. The familiar tone, the slightest hint of his accent. There could be no doubt. I glared at the man and I shouted, "James, I'm here!" As soon as the words left my mouth, the man was upon me again. A sharp pain went up my leg as he forced me against the cave wall, hand again clapped over my mouth. This time I could see panic in his eyes. He didn't say anything, simply held me there. And for several minutes we simply listened to the frantic voice of my friend as he shouted and begged for me to come out. I heard him pray that I was all right. Eventually, James stopped shouting, and the man released his grip on me, with the fear still plain on his face. Then came the pounding. James was hammering on the door with something. The man's eyes grew wide, and again he hissed at me.
"Not a word."
And he went for me to grab his spear. The panic and fear I saw in the man bled into my own feelings. I doubted James could get through the massive stone door, even with proper tools, and a large part of me was relieved he was safe. I watched the man hold his spear at the ready, scanning the stone for any signs of movement. His eyes wild, sweat glistening in the candlelight. I was the one in danger. The man genuinely believed James was something dangerous. He refused to listen to me. and I was essentially trapped in that narrow cave with what I was recognizing was an insane person. I resisted the urge to call out for James again, and the hammering and scraping eventually died away. Still, the man stood there, spear held at the ready, eyes watching the stone. I decided not to do anything to upset him, and so we waited in silence for hours. Eventually, I approached him, endeavoring to speak quietly about what he plans to do. When I reached him, his lips were moving faintly as he scanned the stone door. He was counting. Soon he turns to me, and I could tell he had calmed down. He said nothing, but bent down and picked up the nearly burnt-out candle and handed it to me. Silently, he removed the large wooden beam that blocked the door, and slowly he moved the massive rock along its worn groove until it rested against the wall next to the entrance. The sunlight spilled in as he did so. We stepped out into the morning. There were no noticeable footprints that I could see outside the door, at least none I could discern from our own 2 barefooted tracks, but still, the man tried to follow some trace he must have seen. He left immediately, setting off into the woods, eyes scanning quickly for clues from the ground to the branches just overhead. I myself ate a breakfast of fruits and resolved to stay in the camp for the day. If James had made it here at night, I was pretty sure he could find the place again by daylight. I managed to get a fire going again and heaped the large jungle leaves onto it to produce smoke. I also scanned the sky for any other smoke from James's campfire, and the day passed in this manner. In the afternoon, the man returned alone again. He was noticeably tired, and he ignored me, going instead straight to the water jug we had left in the cave, drinking deeply from the ladle. Eventually, he went and procured dried fish for us, and sat with me at the fire. We ate in silence for a while, but eventually I had to speak. "My friend is alive. He's on the island," I said. The man looked at me. I could sense his uneasiness.
I could not find him,
he said. "But he found us," I said.
in the night.
He replied. "He could have seen our fire, and we're on a hill. You leave all your things outside. It's possible." Again, I saw the unease on him, and he seemed to hesitate a moment before simply answering,
No.
"Then who was it?" I asked. He shook his head, but didn't hesitate this time.
A monster. A demon. Something. Not your friend.
"Are you insane? You heard him yourself." I nearly shouted it, but he didn't turn to face me. He simply watched the dying fire while he ate. Eventually, he spoke.
I will protect you.
And I felt a chill run up my spine. We spoke no more, and that night I stayed close to the door, too, and waited. But James didn't return. For a week, things continued with no change. The man and I barely spoke, and I stayed wary of him at all times. He practiced with his spear every morning, caught fish to eat, or smoked some to preserve, and vanished for most of the day, sometimes returning early with fruits or to work in his garden. It became clear to me that James had either been rescued or was unable to come back to the cave. If I was to find him, or anyone, I would have to start venturing out. The next day I told the man I was going to come with him. I thought he would outright reject the idea, but instead he came over and examined me. He told me I looked healthier and could follow him to the beach so long as my leg was all right. I assured him it would be fine. It was not fine. Days ago I had stopped using the numbing cream the man had given me, and while my ankle seemed to be getting better, I realized I had been wrong. I followed the man on the painfully long walk to the beach. My teeth gritted the entire way against the pain. When we arrived, I had no strength to search for James or anyone else. I simply sat and buried my ankle in the hot sand, glad for a different, more soothing type of pain. The man himself went into the water with his spear, wading out past the waves and then diving under the water. He seemed to stay under for minutes at a time, always coming up with a fish on his spear. After about the fourth one, he came back and stood next to me, putting the fish into the loosely woven net he had brought.
Done already? I asked, hoping for more time to reset my aching leg. He nodded and gestured to the fish.
After too many, the sharks come. Somehow, they always know.
He hefted the nets over to his shoulder and made to head back. I got up to follow him. I could barely walk. If there had been any wonder as to whether my ankle was broken or not, it was now gone. It was swollen and an awful black and purple, so much so the skin had split and started bleeding. I couldn't put any weight on it and went from tree to tree to support myself, the man far ahead of me now. Eventually he must have reached camp and come back for me, as he no longer had the fish. He supported me the rest of the way. He said nothing as he bandaged my wounds. He sewed the largest splits on my leg tightly and with surprising skill. He affixed a new splint and boiled strips of cloth, eventually bandaging everything tightly.
You need to heal,
he said, and I could do nothing but agree. I stood no chance of finding James, nor escaping my savior. If help was to be found, it would have to come to me. That night we went to bed early, and the man seemed uneasy. The feeling spread to me, and since I already couldn't sleep due to the pain of my leg, I was awake when he lit the candle with several sharp noises. The light was behind him, casting his large shadow on the wall away from me as I lay there, watching. He laid his spear across his lap as he sat, breathing deeply. At times he seemed to even be asleep, but always he sat straight up, his huge muscled back heaving as he watched the door. When he heard them call my name, he jumped up. It was Lori, her meek voice barely coming through from the other side of the rock. She must have been just outside. I could barely make out her words, but I heard her. She asked if I was there. Stone still, the man stood, watching and waiting, his entire body tense. I could see the whites of his knuckles as he gripped the spear. Then I heard Ben's voice. He called my name several times. He said they were okay. They were here to help. My heart leapt to my throat, and the relief I felt drowned out the pain and fear I had felt until then. They were alive. They were all right. And as I began to sit up, ready to call back to them, I saw the man's eyes, the fierce determination sparkling in them, the grim expression on his face. It suddenly struck me. He would kill them. I realized it as the joy and relief drained from me as quickly as it had appeared. He would have killed James, too. I didn't know what fascination he had with me, and me alone, if there was some ulterior motive to him helping me. But whatever it was, it didn't extend to my friends. Perhaps he really was simply insane. Could a man live alone on an island eating fish and fruit for 30 years and stay sane? The more I questioned it, the more I seemed to worry. Eventually, Ben's voice died away. I felt panic wash over me. I had to let them know I was here. I could find them in a day. I could escape tomorrow when the man left, but they had to know I was here tonight. I called out, "Ben, I'm here!" I shouted as loudly as I could, my voice ringing and echoing off the narrow cave walls. The man turned to me, spear in hand, shock plain on his face. I heard Ben's voice call for me, and I got to my feet. "Ben, get away! I'm safe!" And the man rushed towards me. I placed my hands in front of my face to ward him off, and just before he reached me, the banging started. It was louder than before. It sounded like they were banging at the door with tools again. The man regarded the door with a worried expression, as if trying to decide between myself and the door. Eventually he moved away from me, faced the door, and readied his spear. The banging was getting louder. It was echoing in the cavern. If they broke through, he would kill them for sure. My mind raced, and I remembered the crude wooden door at the back of the cave. There might be another way out. I picked up the candle on the ground between us and moved as quickly as I could along the wall, away from the door, away from the man. He saw me as I rounded the bend in the cave, and I heard him shout something, but it was drowned out by the banging. I fumbled to open the door, but it was held fast somehow. I pulled at the old wood around the crude door frame and opened it from inside, closing it again behind me. Here the entire wall, ceiling, and floor were crudely paneled. Roughly hewed logs and boards made the room feel like I was actually indoors.
A roughly made bed, stuffed and covered in some sort of canvas, sat to one side. A large, intact wooden crate sat at the end of it, and as I shined the candle around the room, I saw other small details and crude furnishings. A half-built chair, an actual stool, missing a leg but crudely repaired, another long box on which sat a crackled hand mirror and rusted scissors. It felt so strange in that moment to catch a glimpse of such humanity in that savage man I had come to know. Here was a life long gone, pieced back together with driftwood and twine, 30 years in the making. Suddenly, something made my ears perk up. The absence of sound. The banging had stopped. Again, I looked at the room for another exit, and there, in the back, I found it. A hole where the boards didn't quite meet. The place was roughly patched over, like it had been closed and opened several times. I pressed the boards aside and continued on. The cavern seemed to go on forever. At parts I had to squeeze myself to get by, but on and on it went, just one straight line. I didn't know how much time passed. I had to rest often, and I could feel my swollen ankle pulling at the fresh stitches, at the splint itself straining against the swell. I walked slowly, minding the candle as I went, and eventually the cavern widened and ended. There was no exit. I despaired. Again, I examined the walls and ceiling for any way out, any sign of a draft or light, and as I paced the room several times, I stepped on something. It rolled under my foot with a hollow sound, and I fell. It had been a bone. I scanned the ground with the candle, illuminating bones in small piles, neatly stacked around the edge of the room. My heart pounded in my ears. The feeling of dread slowly crept over my body as I noted the human skulls atop the piles. Some were old, the bones worn and cracked, while others seemed newer, dull, white, with flecks of red and gray still stuck to them. Still, I looked closer, careful not to touch them. They all had a rough quality to them, as if they had been ground down, and for a brief moment, a memory of my dog flashed across my mind, and my stomach turned. The bones had been chewed on. I stood shakily, barely able to take in what I was seeing, and I backed away from the piles. I didn't want to count them. I didn't want to see them. And as I turned to leave the way I came, the candle illuminated the man, spear in hand, standing silently in my way.
I'm sorry. I didn't want you to see this,
he said solemnly. My heart raced, and I felt myself backing away from him. He took a single step towards me, and I threw the candle. Instead of being burned or caught off guard, he instead deftly swatted it away, but I was already running, moving faster than I had since I washed up on the island. I slid past him into the narrow passage just out of his reach. Immediately, I pressed onwards, moving as quickly as I could, always hearing him behind me. On and on I went, the narrow squeezes being the only time I could gain any distance on him. By the time I reached the room and barreled through the door, I was exhausted. I called for Ben, for Lori, for James, but there was no answer, no banging. My foot was slick with blood where the stitches had torn, and the splint was gone. Still, I ignored the pain, and when I made my way to the door, I placed my hands on the wooden beam. I heard the man come out of the room further back. I heaved the wooden beam out of place with all my might, just barely lifting it and dropping it behind me. "Stop," he said, as I reached for the edge of the massive stone door. "I'm going to my friends. I'm leaving." I shouted the words at him as he moved towards me, my hands firmly on the stone.
Please, I will find your friends in the morning. Stop this.
He made to grab me, and I slapped his hands away. Realization hit me. The grave look in his eyes pierced me. "You will, won't you? You will find them. You found James. Oh, God, you did, didn't you?" My mind went to the bones in the back of the cave. Pain, exhaustion, fear, all replaced with anger. "It's you," I shouted as I pulled the stone with all my might. "You're the monster." The stone cracked. I felt it come towards me in my hands. Split in two, the massive rock fell towards me, and I shifted my weight, trying to press myself against the wall to avoid being crushed.
The man, whether to save me or grab me, ended up in my place as the huge piece of stone came down. For a moment, it looked as though he might actually hold it up, but it cracked again, splitting at the groove where it set into the floor, and suddenly it collapsed on him, crushing him. Sunlight filled the cave, and I stepped outside in shock. The cave door had been horribly marked and scraped by my friends, and it was no wonder it had cracked. If I had been any later, or waited one more night, it's likely they would have broken through the door to meet a spear point. I looked for any trace of the man crushed under the door, but only saw a small drop of blood as it traced a groove in the cave floor. I shivered, and just as I went to walk away, the huge piece of stone began to move. I stood still, watching. The man was alive, lifting his way out from under what must have been a ton of solid rock. I heard him grunting, straining with effort as I stepped back as the stone rolled off of him. He stood, breathing heavily, and came towards me. Clumsily, I backed down the hill, and slowly he came towards me. The broken wooden half of his spear clutched in his hand. It was badly blunted on both ends, and I realized it saved him from being completely crushed. Still, his other arm was severely broken, his ribs on the same side seemingly crushed, making him look oddly uneven. His breathing was ragged and strained. His blood began to drip from his mouth as I tried to talk. Whatever he said, I didn't hear it. I moved back farther away from him, and I heard him exert himself, blood spattering his lips as he croaked. "Stop! You killed my friends," I said. "I suppose he's the right kind of meat, eh?" I spat the words at him, no longer afraid. He stepped towards me, but I stood my ground. I remembered how James had found me, had tried to save me, had asked if I was okay. I was furious.
They are dead, he croaked again. But I did not kill them. Can't survive the night, he gasped. I will protect you.
You didn't kill those people? You, the man with the spear, the only person still alive on this island. My anger had reached a boiling point. The man looked pained, straining to speak.
They were my friends, my family, people like you,
he said. The blood bubbled as he talked, and spilled over his lips again. He dropped his broken spear, but I saw the fire in his eyes then. For a moment, he was again the imposing giant man he had always been.
I saw it kill them, saw it eat them. A monster. This was its lair.
He lamely gestured back to the cave with his good arm and paused to catch his breath.
It comes for you. I will kill it this time.
He fell to his knees, gasping. The pain racked him. Something clicked in my mind, and I watched him hunched on the ground there. He knew the truth, but the fervor with which he spoke, the fire in his eyes, he was fighting. The shrine-like room at the end of the cave, the bones, the desire to protect me. It's guilt. I said it without meaning to. You know you're a monster. You're fighting your urges. Jesus Christ, you really ate them. The shock made me lightheaded. What happened to James? He said nothing, not looking at me, and I thundered the question at him again, as loud as I could. He simply shook his head, unable to speak, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. I felt numb with shock. I backed away from the man and ran, unthinking, as fast as my leg would allow me. All day I shouted for James, for Ben, for Laurie. I trudged through the hot sand along the beach, trailing blood, shouting until my throat hurt. On and on, just like on that first day, weeks ago. I walked until the sun began to set, and this time, as I sat down in the sand, tired from 2 days without sleep and a broken ankle, I heard a boat engine. They were coming towards me. I tried to stand, but I couldn't. By the time they got me onto a stretcher, it was all I could do to confirm my name. They told me I had lost a lot of blood, and the tiredness and weight of everything began to take hold of me. I told them to find my friends, to find Ben and Laurie, and someone told me that they were safe, and with that sudden feeling of relief, I passed out.
When I woke in the hospital, I groaned, and panic took hold of me for the briefest of moments. From somewhere close by, I heard, "You slept for over a day." It was James's voice. He came to the bedside and helped me sit up slowly. Tears formed my eyes as I saw Laurie and Ben get up from the nearby table and come to me. I thought you were dead," I said shakily. "Us? You've been missing for nearly 2 weeks," James said. I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had since before the storm. The relief welled up inside of me. I told them everything that had happened from the moment I washed up and saw the flare until I escaped. I apologized for not being able to help them, explaining how the cannibal had trapped me, how my leg had been broken. Ben noted the cast on my leg, and over I expressed how glad I was that they had made it out together. They were solemn, taking in the details of my awful story, sharing worried looks with each other, and so I left out the more unsettling details of the cave. "So you heard us, you said?" Laurie asked. "I did. I tried to shout to you, to tell you I was all right, but..." I trailed off, remembering the awful man poised on the other side of the rock, ready to strike. "And me, then you said you heard me too?" James asked, and I told him how I thought he had been killed, tears once more welling up in my eyes. They comforted me, and Laurie, looking concerned, took my hand in hers. "You've been through a lot," she said. "We'll go let the doctor know you're up." She and Ben gave me a smile and left the room, and James moved to join them, but hesitated in the doorway. "You're okay, aren't you?" He asked the question strangely, but I smiled and nodded. "I am now," I said. "Look, when we fired up that flare, the three of us, together, we were rescued. Someone came for us that morning," he said, worry in his eyes. "What?" The three of us, we never found you or a cave. We were only on that island for a few hours." In the summer between my senior year of high school and the start of college, I got a job working the evening shift at my town's local crab shack from 2:30 until 9. You know the place, even if you've never been there. If you've ever gone on vacation to Maine or Cape Cod or really anywhere in coastal New England, you've seen at least a dozen places like it. Ramshackle eateries along the boardwalk, decorated with oars and lobster traps, hand-painted signs advertising standard fare, lobster rolls, clam strips, hamburgers, onion rings, fries. I'd eaten there once or twice growing up, but it was more for the tourists than the locals. For the most part, it was a pretty normal place, but there were two weird things about it. First was that the cook, Ramondo, was completely blind. I know that sounds crazy, and I didn't believe it at first either, but the longer I worked there, the more I began to see how it was possible. The kitchen wasn't a big place, and Ramondo, a withered and leathery man with a permanent grimace and a permanent slump to his posture, knew by routine its every in and out. From what I could see through the little window behind the register, he kept his kitchen utensils clearly organized using a system of hooks hanging from a corkboard, and with a menu as limited as ours, he could very easily just fall into a comfortable routine, no sight required. There was a rumor he was mute, too, but I heard him speak once. The second thing about the crab shack was that it was open 24 hours a day. It may not sound that weird, but for one thing, even during the busy season, late June through early September, nothing out here stays open all night long, and I mean nothing. We're a tourist town, yeah, but we're not one of the big ones. Just a bump on the map halfway between Gloucester and Innsmouth. Nothing here is open past midnight, let alone all night long. I only knew one of the night shift guys, Chuck Landingham, a smallish, preppy-looking kid I'd gone to high school with. Not a friend exactly, just someone you recognized when you see him in the hallway. Back in May, when I first started, he used to come in a little early, and we'd chat a bit while I rang out my register and washed up for the night. As the summer passed, though, working the night shift took a toll on Chuck. I wasn't surprised.
Switching to a completely nocturnal schedule must be pretty rough for anyone. Dark circles appeared and then grew long beneath his eyes, which themselves took on a faraway look that I can't quite describe, except to say that even when he met my gaze, he didn't seem to see me, seemed instead to look through me at some invisible mystery on the other side of my head. He became distant, quiet, withdrawn, and by the end of July we'd stopped chatting altogether. One night, as I was leaving, he stopped by, grabbing me by the wrist and holding me back. He looked at me expectantly and opened his mouth as if to speak, but let go without saying anything and turned away. I was halfway to the door when I heard him mutter to himself, "I can't do it anymore," he whispered in a dull, defeated tone, and then a little louder, I can't do it anymore." He quit not long after that, but that was the last time I saw him. I don't know where he is now. After he left, I got a frantic call from my boss, the owner of the restaurant, asking if I could pick up Chuck's last few night shifts. After seeing the toll it had taken on him, I wasn't inclined to agree, especially because the summer was winding down and college would start in just a couple weeks for me. I was already considering giving my notice early and taking a little time to relax. The last thing I wanted was to completely retool my sleep schedule right before I started my academic career. I can't say what it was exactly that changed my mind. No, that's a lie. He offered me time and a half of the night shift's rates, plus he'd still pay me for my regular shifts, even though I wouldn't be working them. He begged with me, pleaded with me to pick up the shifts, and I remember being a bit put off by his dramatics. There was actually fear in his voice, like he was scared the crab shack might have to simply close for a night or two. Or 3, actually. There were 3 of them. 3 overnight shifts I agreed to cover. Just 3 shifts, and I'd be making more money in just that time than I had the whole previous month. I don't have a lot to say about my first night shift at the crab shack. The most noteworthy thing I could mention is this. Nobody came. Nobody at all. I rolled in that night at 9 p.m., at the same time I'd normally be leaving, and I took over for Jackie, another one of the cashiers whom I didn't know very well. After she left, I was a little surprised to glance through the little window that led into the kitchen and see that Ramondo was still there, apparently working the night shift too. Didn't this guy ever go home? The more I think about it, the more I began to realize how unlikely it was that for the past 3 months it had always been Ramondo at the grill. Didn't the crab shack have any other cooks? "Hey man," I called into the kitchen sometime after 2 a.m. Is it always this dead on the overnight?" No answer. I drove home the next morning as exhausted as I'd ever been, never mind that no customers had ever materialized. Sometimes work is less exhausting than boredom. At least if I'd kept busy, there'd have been something to occupy my mind. When I got home, I crawled into bed and slept all morning, into the afternoon, straight through the day and into the evening. I have even less to say about my second night shift. This time I didn't bother to try and engage the cook in conversation, but other than that, the night was exactly the same. I was exhausted from the beginning, so the hours felt even longer this time. Felt even more boring and somehow even emptier. The next morning, as I climbed into bed, I remember thinking, now I understand why the shift burned Chuck out the way it had. But I was wrong. On the third night, we had a customer.
Here he comes.
The blind cook spoke in a deep voice, much deeper than his slight and elderly frame would suggest. He spoke up out of nowhere, and it took me by surprise, as much because I'd never heard him speak before, as because I had no idea what he meant. When I glanced up from my phone, I saw that the dining room was still empty. The windows against the far wall still displayed nothing but the thick blanket of night, marred only by what little stretch of pavement the anemic streetlights could reach. Who? I started to ask, but before I got any further, the front door opened, and in walked my first and only customer during my 3 nights on the night shift at the crab shack. He was a tall man, tall and broad, filling the doorway before moving forward with a liquid grace, surprising for someone of his size, letting the door slam behind him. He wore a suit with a matching short-brimmed Panama hat.
both crisp and clean and of a color I'd never seen before. What I cannot describe is his face. It's not that I've forgotten. No, every detail of that night is unfortunately burned into my memory for as long as I live. The reason I cannot describe his face is that I found I could not look at it. When I tried, every time I tried, my eyes would simply glide right past it, or around it, and I would find myself staring at something just past his shoulder, or over his head, or down at the knots in his tie, or up at the cloth band around his hat. Welcome to the Crab Shack, I greeted him in a dry whisper, the only voice I found I could muster. Can I take your order? He nodded slightly. Even without seeing his face, that nod conveyed the presence of a smile. And then he ordered. I cannot recount his order here. I would not know how to begin, nor would I dare repeat it if I could. He ordered in a language I had never heard before, barely even registered as a language, guttural and elegant and moist. His order contained noises I had never heard before in a human voice. Terrible words with uncharted vowels, a language which it is my dearest hope I will never have the misfortune of hearing ever again. Worse yet, I found myself nodding, as I would to any other customer, as if he had ordered a simple lobster roll or hamburger or a plate of clam strips. With my eyes still on the knot of his tie, I punched a few buttons on the register. I never saw what they were, and my hands moved as if on their own accord. I don't know what his total came to, and I don't know what he gave me, but it was not money. I placed it on the register, though later when I looked again, it wasn't there. I turned and made my way over to the little window in the kitchen. Hey, Ramondo, I called out. The guy wants a... And then, impossibly, horribly, I found myself repeating the order back to the chef. Word for word, noise for noise. It all came back. But as terrible as the sound of those words was, the feel of them coming out of me was even worse. Like an angry school of slippery eels thrashing and fighting as they clawed up my throat, birthed into the night by my unwilling vocal cords.
You got it,
Ramondo answered balefully, and then he began to cook. As I've said, I could not see far into the kitchen, and definitely not far enough to see just what it was that Ramondo placed in the deep fryer that night. I could see him holding something with both hands, something heavy by the way he struggled, and yet no bigger than a small meatloaf. The sound it made when it hit the hot oil surpassed the familiar sizzle of any seafood I'd heard fried before, not just louder, but higher in pitch and almost emotive, almost like a scream. The smell it made I will not try to describe, except to say that even now there are still nights when I awake in a sweat from dreams that consist of nothing more than that smell.
Order up.
I broke myself out of my reverie as I saw that Ramondo had slid towards me a plate, a horrible plate holding a fried nightmare from which I should have looked away, right away, immediately away. But I couldn't. I wish I had. Instead, I will have to live the rest of my life remembering that dish, remembering that order, and that sick and twisted and horrible order. The circular burst of tentacles, all deep-fried and no two the same length, none originating from a common point, each sticking off in its own direction. One of them not a tentacle at all, but a finger curled up as if making a come-hither gesture. A long and gnarly fingernail peeking out through the bread, a jagged row of flat white teeth, just half a jaw, a quarter smile, no more than a slight curvature ending in a single incisor. And the claws, too. Of course, the claws. The claws with no arm attached, but which emerged from that dead lump of flesh like mushrooms growing in a cluster on a cadaver's cheek. Finally, and most horribly, near the center of the mass bulge, what I thought at first resembled a blister, but which I quickly realized was not, but an eye. A single hazel eye, dead but staring with a preserved sadness. But did I see it blink? Did I see it turn, ever so slightly, to meet mine directly and to stare in a silence and unheeded plea for clemency? Did it look at me? Did it blink? Impossible. I tell myself. I couldn't have. I imagined it. The man, or whatever it was, but a man it was not, took the tray from me. I think he might have nodded his thanks, but I couldn't be sure. He carried his meat over to one of the booths and sat with his back to me. All I could see were his shoulders. When he ate, he barely moved. His arms never left his side. After he left, I worked up the nerve and then turned once more to the little window in the kitchen. What? I started to ask, before erupting into a sudden coughing fit, my throat suddenly thick with mucus. What the fuck was that? I can barely see Raimondo, just the right side of his face, just enough to notice when he smiled. The first time I had seen any expression beyond indifference across that leathery countenance. There was no mirth within it, though. It almost seemed cruel, even sadistic. All he said was,
"Don't you have to go bust his tray?"
I quit the next day. I haven't been back since. A week later, I left for college, and as soon as I could, I transferred somewhere else, somewhere further inland. I never visited home. I still haven't. Not in all the years since, and I don't think I ever will. I'm more comfortable out here, where the only seafood restaurant's the occasional Red Lobster, far from the ocean where live such creatures as the one I once served. But it's not that creature itself that haunts me the most when I recall that summer before my freshman year of college, though haunt me it does. I often dream of what it might have been before it met Raimondo's deep fryer. Nor is it the identity of the man whose face would accept not even the slightest glance, nor the nature of his relationship with my boss, the owner of the crab shack, that had left the latter in such obvious mortal terror at the thought of the restaurant closing for even a single night shift. No. The question that dominates my mind and forces me into fixation until I tear my thoughts away back to matter more benign is, and always will be, did I see it blink? My mom was on a business trip, and my father was at the nearby convenience store, buying cigarettes, or yuckies as he called them. It was his tactic to ensure I wouldn't smoke, and it worked. It was 9 a.m., and usually my father would arrive home in about 10 minutes. However, we lived in more of a wooded area, and the closest convenience store was about 2 kilometers away. I hated that my parents decided to live in this godforsaken place. Literally everywhere we went was a trip. If I had my way, we would have lived in a centrally located area, where people lived nearby and the police wouldn't take 15 minutes to arrive to a house break-in. About 14 minutes passed, and I went to the kitchen to grab leftover tortellini. As I opened the microwave door, I heard what sounded like a chalkboard being scraped with a switchblade, and I dropped my plates in fear. It shattered on the floor, and I groaned a long, "Fuck." That was not the most important thing right now. I still needed to figure out what in God's name made that noise. The only pet in the house was my pet cockatiel, Heather, and she was a very silent bird, except for when she was hungry. I opened the utensil drawer and pulled out a cutting knife. I left my phone in my room, and my heart rate was rising quickly, and I had no idea what to do. The most logical reason in my mind was to make a break for it. I booked it to my room, tripping over dining room chairs, but as I was reaching for my bedroom door, I saw him. His, or its, most notable feature was his permanent grin. It was nothing like I saw before, but seemed human. It was an emotionless grin. It was an emotionless grin, like one you make to try and seem tough in front of your middle school crush when you fall out of your seat. His teeth were incredibly bright, as if they could light up a mine shaft. His body looked elongated and stretched to its breaking point, like a piece of gum that's at its last strand. Like one tiny nudge could make his body fall apart. It was like a stress toy the teachers give to special children in class, the ones that have bite marks in them. He had no hair whatsoever, not a single strand, just this alien but strangely familiar creature. It looked like he was made out of melted aluminum, and strangely, he had no eyes. But the most terrifying thing is that I could feel him watching me. I tried to run, but my eyes were locked onto him, and his smile slowly grew,
as he slowly lifted his skimpy leg and started to come closer. I tried to scream, but my mouth felt stapled shut. It was like he was trying to play with me, like how some animals play with their prey as they wait for their impending doom. I felt myself start to cry. I thought of how incomplete my life was. I didn't want to die, not now. The creature could see my tears, and the lights went out. Everything was pitch black. I couldn't see a thing. I screamed as loud as I could, and my dad burst through the door. My dad screamed, "Mark!" in terror. The lights went on again, and I saw my dad in the front door. I lunged at him in tears, afraid and confused. Did you see it?" I sobbed into his arm. What? See what?" "The monster. Did you see him?" I muttered. I have no idea what you're talking about. What monster? Why were you screaming?" He replied, brushing my hair out of my face. His hands felt like charcoal. I explained everything to him as best I could. Thankfully, he didn't believe I was insane at first and dialed 911. They gave a detailed search and found no trace of any intruders in my house. How could they find nothing? He seemed so real. It couldn't possibly be a hallucination. I decided to sleep in my father's room that night. For the first few nights, after everything seemed normal, I got a new job as a mall security guard, and my mom was coming home soon. I saw him again on my 4th day on the job. It was the last hour before the mall closed, and we closed fairly late for a mall, 8:57 to be exact. There were only about 10 stragglers in the mall. I was stationed at the food courts, and my co-worker Ernesto was nearby at the clothing stores. I never got to know the others, but they were scattered around. There was only about 20 minutes left until closing time, and I heard my walkie-talkie go off. "Need assistance at American Eagle ASAP. Over," Ernesto's raspy voice said. "I'll be there. Over," I responded. Strangely, no one else picked up on the walkie-talkie. I was running down the escalator as every single light went out in an instant. My heart sank. Is that godforsaken creature back again? I couldn't see anything, so I felt around for my flashlight and turned it on. "Hello?" I yelled. Not a single sound whatsoever except my heavy breaths. I turned on my walkie-talkie. "Is anyone there?" I said, scared shitless. It took around 4 seconds for a response, but I heard my walkie-talkie go off, and all that could be heard was a raspy breath. What scared me even more is that the breath was nearby. I nearly pissed myself as I ran to the escalator and hid in the back of a Johnny Rockets. No one was there. I came to the conclusion that I was in this mall with the creature. I closed the door and pushed the metal racks against the door, making a shabby barricade. I tried to dial 911, but all that was on the other line was the raspy breathing from the walkie-talkie. I dialed every number I could think of, but it was the same exact raspy breathing. I decided to try and shock him with my taser. He was heavily banging on the door, and it wouldn't hold much longer. I quickly turned the door handle and shocked it. It made a scream that made me collapse to the floor in agony, and my ears had started bleeding. For some reason, it still smiled. I quickly got up, blood pouring from my ears, and ran down the escalator. I ran to the emergency exits, and I could hear its footsteps behind me. I could feel my throat start to tighten, and I wanted to collapse. I kicked open the door and ran into the road. I looked behind me and saw the creature grinning at me. He waved his arm and waved like a goodbye wave. He walked back into the mall and faded into the darkness. I instantly dialed 911 with thoughts rushing through my mind. Was he waving, saying that I was free? No, it couldn't be that simple. In all the terror, I somehow forgot about the blood from my ears. To my surprise, it wasn't there anymore. I had no idea what to think. I just froze. I sat there in the middle of the road for 5 minutes. No cars passed for that whole entire time. My little pause in time broke when I heard the police sirens. I quickly ran to them and explained what happened. The police searched through the mall. The lights were off, like I said, but when they went inside of the American Eagle, they found Ernesto and some other guards' dead corpses. Their eyes had been removed, and their blood spelled out Mark. I never slept the same after that. I still had night terrors from the experience, but I never saw the creature after that. I don't know if I've escaped from him yet, but
He has given me a few years of peace.